Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Lorraine opened her eyes and smiled happily. Only here, in the village, at her beloved grandmother's place, could she feel truly happy. It would seem that she had everything that girls of her age could only dream of. A spacious apartment in the city center, an expensive car, regular trips to foreign resorts. But it did not bring her much happiness. Years went by, and she never had a family or a worthy young man. Her age was approaching 27 years. In relationships with the opposite sex were a total disappointment. Every time someone new appeared in her life, it seemed to her that here it was, happiness, and it was he who would become the most beloved and long-awaited. Everything started out about the same, but ended up with the same scenario. For example, Kyle happened to be nearby in traffic. He went to great lengths to get her phone number. A young, athletic guy, in a friend's expensive car. He asked her out on dates and gave her flowers. Exactly 1 month later, Kyle, vividly painted, as if he were reopening the business, asked her for a large sum of money ostensibly as a loan. When Lorraine refused, he tried a couple more times to ask for money, but then disappeared. A couple days later, she happened to see him and a long-legged blonde woman getting out of his SUV. Lorraine was worried because she really liked Kyle, but after a while, standing in line at the supermarket checkout counter, Lorraine met Anthony, a jovial joker, light as a breeze. He was standing in front of her in line, and when it was his turn, he suddenly said, "Stand in front of me. I want a couple more minutes to admire such beauty. Isn't your name Venus by any chance? That's just the name of the Roman goddess of beauty." Then he quickly paid for his purchases, caught up with her at the entrance, and gallantly picking up her packages, said, "Let me help you." Goddesses shouldn't carry heavy things. Lorraine wanted to be rude to the intrusive beau, but he had so much charm that she agreed to walk with him in the park. That day they walked through the alleys, kicked fallen leaves, ate ice cream, and Lorraine in these moments was insanely happy. They started dating. Anthony said that he worked as a manager in some company and earned enough. He did not invite her to visit him, citing the renovation of the new mortgage apartment. Lorraine dated him for a little over 3 months, until one day he came in tears and began to tell her that his firm was almost bankrupt and was about to lay everyone off. "I'm begging you," he said, kissing her hands, "help me please. I will definitely get a new job, but it will take time. I have a big mortgage debt piling up. If I don't pay it off, I'll end up on the street. Please, I'll pay it all back." The amount was such that Lorraine asked in surprise, "But that's not for 1 month. How much have you not paid?" She couldn't understand how, having accumulated such a debt, the bank hadn't foreclosed on his home. She offered to go there and check the calculations. At this, Anthony changed dramatically. From affectionate, he turned into a scandalizer. "What, you do not believe me? You don't want money? You have plenty of it. What is it worth just to give the right amount, and you don't need to check me? I'm not a little boy to walk on my arm and check up on me." At that moment, Lorraine felt hurt that everything that had started so well was ending so sadly. She replied sharply, "Well, if you're not a little boy, you should be able to solve your own problems and not accumulate such debts." He left, slamming the door, and never appeared or called again. It seemed that at that moment Lorraine was ready to put an end to her personal life. For a whole year she could not even think about a new relationship, rejecting all advances. To pull her out of this gloomy state, a friend invited Lorraine to her birthday party at a restaurant. In a town not far from Lorraine won the heart of a young musician, Oliver. As soon as Lorraine entered the hall, their gazes met. All evening he sang, looking only at her, as if dedicating the songs to Lorraine. At intermission, Oliver came up and whispered softly, "You're amazing. I beg you, don't disappear. I'll be free soon and I'll be sure to steal you away. By the way, my name is Oliver." He kissed her hand gallantly and disappeared just as quickly. There were some waves coming off of Ollie Emily that made her dizzy. She wanted to cuddle up to this tall blonde man, 6 feet tall, and feel like a defenseless girl. From the first moment, Oliver seemed like a strong, attractive man. After the show, he really kidnapped Lorraine, and they rode a motorcycle all night. They parted in the morning. Oliver kissed her tenderly and said, "I want to see you every day. I believe in love at first sight. I'll see you tomorrow at 12:00 at the same place." All night, Lorraine stayed up all night, anticipating the new meeting. She was going on the date like a schoolgirl with a fluttering heart. It was easy with Oliver, as if they'd known each other for 100 years without talking about work or money. He could call and say he'd be back in 5 minutes with a surprise. He would come, pick her up, and half an hour later they would sit on the shore of the lake at a makeshift table with champagne and fruit. There was also a passionate night in the hayloft. Once under Lorraine's windows he had laid out a heart with candles, stood with a bouquet, thinking up something new to surprise and delight her. Lorraine wanted Oliver to be different and not ruin the relationship by asking for money. She realized that they were different people with different incomes and needs. but it was so good with him that she was willing to overlook it. Oliver started talking about getting married, but one day he came home from work brooding. When Lorraine asked what was wrong, he said, "You see, my lifelong dream is to release an album. I'm sure it will be my finest hour, but it takes a lot of money. The bank turned me down for a loan." He was silent, expecting Lorraine to offer help, but she changed her face and, holding back tears, whispered, "Go away, please. Go away and don't come back. Why are you all so predictable? Everyone just wants money, money, money. Go away." Surprisingly, Oliver didn't even try to explain himself or convince her that he didn't need her money, that he loved her. He simply, as he always made things easy, packed his things and, without saying goodbye, left. The parting was the last straw in Lorraine's sea of frustration. The only place where, since childhood, she could forget about problems was the house of her beloved grandmother. Dropping everything, she decided to spend at least a week there, where she was definitely loved not for money. Summer Lorraine quickly packed and in a couple hours was in the village. Her grandmother met her, happily wiping away tears of joy, and laid her down to rest, humming her favorite lullaby from childhood. It had been a long time since Lorraine had slept so soundly and carefree. When she woke up, she went to the kitchen, where the painfully familiar smell of pancakes was coming from. "My little angel is awake," Grandma said affectionately and added sternly, "but wash up first. I've set the table." They drank tea for a long time, and Lorraine nodded, eating pancakes with sour cream with relish. She didn't seem to be thinking about anything, just enjoying the bird song, the aroma of fresh tea and delicious pancakes. Grandmother wanted to talk, and she began to ask about everything. First about her father, then about her stepmother. "Nothing changes." Putting aside the mug of tea, Lorraine replied sadly. "Like she's off the chain, isn't she? One minute she's turning her father against her, and then sometimes he's fine." "Grandma, don't think about it. Catherine's a good person. She cares about her father a lot, but I'm still like a bone in her throat. All my life dreamed of sending me somewhere, then in a foreign university, then in some business trip, allegedly on company business. I don't care. I'm used to her." Lorraine didn't remember her mom. She was 3 years old when she died of some serious illness. Her father grieved for a year and a half, got together with Catherine, his secretary. Another 6 months later they were married, and the newly married wife moved into their home as a full-fledged mistress. Catherine seemed to care, especially in front of her father. She tried to pretend to be a loving mother, but all the years remained for her stepmother. Grandmother always sensed Lorraine's mood and knew how to make her talk. And this time, seeing how depressed her granddaughter arrived, she decided that the problem was Catherine. But when Laura couldn't stand it and told about her failures in love, Grandmother thought for a couple of minutes and said, "You know, my dove, there is a witch who lives on the outskirts of our neighborhood near the forest. They say she has helped many in such matters. You have a day's rest and go to her. God willing, she'll tell you everything." Lorraine didn't really believe in fortune-telling, but after a day of rest and digging in the river like in her childhood, she decided to go to her grandmother's address. The house of the witch was really on the outskirts, as if away from everyone. The gray, shabby structure reminded her of Baba Yaga's hut. Lorraine imagined an old woman with disheveled hair and a long hooked nose opening it. She shrugged her shoulders as if to ward off such images. She knocked and entered the hut. The house was surprisingly clean. It smelled of some kind of herbs. From somewhere in the depths came a woman's voice. "Come in, my dear. Why are you standing on the threshold?" "I'm sorry, I can't meet you. My legs feel like strangers today." Lorraine stepped forward and saw a bright room that looked like a kitchen. At a table covered with an embroidered tablecloth, sitting there was the sweetest little grandmother. There was neither disheveled hair nor hooked nose. A light-colored shawl was tied neatly on her head. She wore a warm vest over her sundress, and her felt boots were visible from under her floor-length skirt. Lorraine even wondered how she could be dressed in such heat. Grandmother, as if reading her thoughts, smiled and, offering to sit down, spoke. "I, my child, used to run around in just sundresses, swimming in the river until deep fall. Now I'm old. I'm ready to stoke the furnace in summer to keep warm." Suddenly she stopped talking. She looked attentively at the guest, took her hand, held it several times as if stroking it. "Do you know, my dear, why you came? It's not your fault. You just haven't met the one and only yet, but there's more to come." Lorraine flinched. It seemed to her that this witch not only knew what she had come with, but also what was to come. What else awaited? "Will I be happy?" she asked quietly. Granny rose with difficulty and slowly went somewhere behind the stove. A few minutes later she returned, and in her hands were several herbs and flowers. Seating herself on a chair, she suddenly said, "Happiness is not always where you look for it. Sometimes it comes from the other side, and now I will weave you a wreath, and you go and throw it into the river. You know, there is a belief that whoever fishes it out will love you." Lorraine had many more questions she wanted to ask, starting with the fact that her grandmother obviously sees and knows much more than she says. But she quickly, without raising her eyes, wove a wreath and, holding it out to Lorraine, said softly, "Go and don't forget to throw it in the river. Remember, happiness may not catch your eye at once. You have to try to see it, look at it, feel it." Having said this, she folded her hands in her lap and covered her eyes, apparently signaling that it was time for her guest to leave. Lorraine was upset. Stepping outside, she looked disappointedly at the wreath. No, she wasn't expecting this. She was expecting a response, something more concrete. Still, she decided to walk back past the river, getting closer to the water. Lorraine took another look at the wreath of intertwined flowers and resolutely threw it as far into the water as she could. To her surprise, the wreath did not sink, but floated for a while to the opposite shore. Claire stood for a moment, as if hoping that the prince would appear from the bushes and pick up her wreath, but there was not a soul around. When the wreath hit the shore on the other side, she sighed and walked toward her grandmother's house. All the way she thought about what had happened, she didn't seem to believe in the story of the wreath, but upon reflection, she decided it was a sign. There was nothing more to hope for. As she approached her grandmother's house, she was already determined to put all worries about her personal life out of her mind. Back in the city, one should just move on without thinking about it. Lorraine quickly packed her things, trying to calm her grandmother, upset that her favorite granddaughter would soon leave. Her grandmother wiped away her tears with the corner of her handkerchief, trying to persuade her to stay a little longer. Lorraine hugged her and kissed her, whispering, "Don't cry, Grandma. I promise I'll be sure to come for a longer stay soon. Summer's just started, so I'll be sure to come." Lorraine started the car, waved goodbye to her grandmother, and hit the road. But as she pulled out of the street and onto the main road, she had to slow down. A young man in a wheelchair was sitting on the curb and about to cross the street. When he saw Lorraine's car, he became confused and froze in place. Lorraine honked to let him pass, but the stroller rolled very slowly. "Well, what are you crawling for? Didn't get a license for the stroller or something?" Grinning, she shouted through the open window. The young man tried to cross the road faster, but the stroller was clearly many years old and could not move faster. Still on the other side, the guy turned around and seemed to want to say something to Lorraine. But she had already pressed the gas pedal and, without looking in his direction, sped away. All the way she was thinking about the fortune teller's words, trying to figure out what and in whom she should see. As soon as Lorraine entered the city, her cell phone rang. Seeing her friend's number, she smiled and answered the call. "Are you crazy?" her friend shouted instead of a greeting, and a little quieter. She continued her outrage. "You almost made us go crazy here. You're not at home. You don't pick up the phone. Dad, who said that he does not follow the adult, independent daughter. In short, to be at home, will be there in an hour. You'll tell us everything." They really appeared with a bottle of her favorite wine and almost from the doorstep demanded an explanation. Lorraine told her friends about the musician's departure, then about the trip to her grandmother's house, the visit to the fortune teller, and the uselessly thrown wreath. After hearing her, her friends laughed, and Lenka said reproachfully, "Claire, I'm just surprised. You're a big girl, but you believe in such fairy tales. We'll take you to a place where you can relax and maybe meet someone." Lorraine waved her hands playfully and said, No. I've had enough of these sentimental novels that are designed to get money out of me. I'm done with love, at least for now. Let's stay at home." Having said this, she knew clearly that her friends would not be stopped by pleading or begging. If they had something in mind, they would definitely fulfill it. It had always been like that in all the years of their friendship, which had lasted since their school days. Her friends silently crossed their arms across their chests and stared at her, and Lorraine said doomfully, All right, I'll change now. Just a heads up. If you try to set me up with anyone, I'll get up and leave right away." The nightclub, where her friends brought her, had recently opened, and Lorraine liked it at once. Cozy atmosphere, delicious food and music that was impossible to sit still to. Lorraine was grateful to her friends for taking her to such an interesting place. As the slow song played, a young man from a neighboring table suddenly approached her and asked her to dance. At another moment, she might have refused him, but at that moment she decided that one dance did not oblige her to anything. She didn't want to embarrass him in front of the friends he came with. During the dance, the young man tried to introduce himself, but Lorraine cut him off abruptly, saying, "Let's make a deal. I'm dancing with you, and that's the end of it. I'm in no mood for introductions at all." Lorraine danced in silence, after which he escorted her to a table and gallantly kissed her hand. For the rest of the evening he watched Lorraine, but did not approach her again. She too, having had a moment, tried to examine him. It seemed the young man was not her type at all. She liked tall, blonde, pumped-up guys, and this one was a medium-sized brunette. But he had so much charm that she suddenly wanted to be near him again. Lorraine waited for a slow song and went to a neighboring table. Approaching the young man, she, smiling, said, "The white dance is not announced here, but I could ask you to ask me again." Wade, that was the young man's name, turned out to be a great conversationalist. They easily found common topics and didn't even notice how the music ended. "I hope I can invite you again," Wade asked, and Lorraine gladly gave her consent this evening. They were both reluctant to part. But Lorraine, remembering a past bad dating experience, decided against continuing the evening. Wade persuaded her, suggested to sit in some quiet, cozy place, but she answered, "No, I'm sorry. I think I've had more than enough socializing for today." But he wasn't going to back down so easily and suggested they meet the next day at the same cafe. "I'll be really looking forward to tomorrow, and I hope you won't regret it," he said. Lorraine really had no regrets. They had a wonderful time. Wade turned out to be like a kindred spirit. He liked the same books, the same movies as Lorraine. He also, like her, favored meat, seafood, and just loved like her cream brulee ice cream. Those weren't the only coincidences. Everything Wade started talking about was interesting to her. Lorraine couldn't believe it was even possible. The affair took off in a hurry. 5 months after they met, Wade proposed to Lorraine with a beautiful ring. She was over the moon. After all, this is the kind of companion she dreamed of. Having accepted the proposal, Lorraine began to prepare for the wedding. It didn't bother her that she'd never met Wade's parents. He very convincingly said that they were on a long business trip abroad, and as soon as they returned, they would congratulate them. Lorraine believed without hesitation and began to organize the wedding. She really wanted to have the most beautiful wedding, and she herself, the best bride. In this fuss and preparations, time flew by unnoticed. Finally, the long-awaited day came. For some reason this morning, while the stylist was doing her hair, Lorraine remembered the wreath she had once thrown into the river. She berated herself for her naivete. Wade had nothing to do with it. He'd never been to those parts, and he certainly hadn't pulled anything out of the river. Yet he had become her soulmate. Lorraine never doubted for a second that he loved her, and everything would be fine, smiling at her reflection. For the first time she felt that she was madly, truly happy. It had nothing to do with the wreath. There were not many guests at the wedding, only a few people from the groom's side, and that only friends. He explained it by the fact that they had been in the city for only a few years, and all the relatives were 1,000 kilometers away, so they didn't come on. Lorraine had about 10 girlfriends invited, and of course her father and stepmother. Registration was held in a solemn atmosphere, and then all moved to the restaurant. And within the first few minutes of her and Wade entering the room, someone called out to Lorraine from somewhere outside. A wheelchair rolled out, and the face of the young man sitting in it looked vaguely familiar. When she saw the wreath she had thrown into the river in his hands, Lorraine immediately remembered their fleeting encounter in the counter. He scooted closer in his chair. "I'm the one who caught it." He held the wreath forward as if showing everyone. "Back then by the river. I was watching you from the opposite bank, and as soon as you left, I picked him up. I didn't show up by accident. I came to meet you. I believed you must have felt it. I fell in love with you the minute you arrived in the village. You know that when you throw a wreath, you'll be with it all your life. I must be by your side, and no one will love you as I do." Lorraine suddenly interrupted him abruptly. From the audience she shouted, "Are you out of your mind, following me around? I don't believe in all this nonsense about burned wreaths. Are you trying to make a fool of me? But who are you and who am I? Get out of here before I call the police. You're making a circus out of this place." At that moment she looked at the cripple, and her heart clenched. There was so much tenderness in his eyes that it seemed as if he would get to his feet and come over and hug Lorraine. The old man only shrugged his shoulders, as if pushing those thoughts away. Still in the same tone she spoke out, "You could have comforted yourself or asked for help." The love and tenderness in the young man's eyes was replaced by pain, resentment, and tears. He slowly turned the stroller around without listening with his hands and rolled toward the exit. His shoulders and head were slumped. The whole world around him seemed to have ceased to exist. When her girlfriend started teasing Lorraine, she couldn't laugh anymore. "But you did," Lenka began, grinning. "Only disappeared for a day or two. Already you've managed to turn someone's head. Look what a gentleman in a carriage has rushed after you tried to encourage Lyasha. And at this rate, you'll soon find yourself without legs, homeless, breaking hearts." Lorraine wanted to interrupt this unpleasant conversation, but Wade intervened. "Don't worry, girlfriends. You can break anyone's heart on your own now. And we have a family. I'm the only man true to his word." He hugged Lorraine and kissed her soundly, and the guests, as if they'd come to their senses, began to shout, bitter the wedding, despite such an unpleasant beginning, went well. The young people were very suitable for each other and looked very happy couple. A few days after the wedding they spent in a country hotel, which is a gift to them paid by Lorraine's father. Wade literally blew dust off his wife, and she, in turn, tried to guess her husband's every wish. "I feel so good. I'm insanely happy. Too bad we only have a few days to be in this paradise place," Wade said, kissing her. Lorraine snuggled up to him and said affectionately, "I'm fine with you too. Don't worry about it. We've got our whole lives ahead of us. We'll get there. It's just that Dad said he really needs me at work, and I can't say no. It's our business together." Lorraine had indeed been working at her father's company for several years after she returned from studying abroad. He had a construction company with offices all over the country. Having studied economics, she helped him in many ways, and she enjoyed it very much. Alex Patrick had stammered several times that he would like Lorraine to head one of the branches, and as soon as they returned from their wedding weekend, he declared, "So daughter, you are now a serious married woman, which means I can now leave you in charge of our company in town with peace of mind. Catherine and I have decided to go north, so it's time to cover that region. I have an army buddy up there who's been asking me to go, and it wouldn't hurt to grow our business up there. You're a smart girl. I know you can handle it. I've officially signed over our local branch to you. So now you're a full-fledged business owner, having handed over all the business and offered to move from the apartment to the country house for the time of their absence." Alex Patrick and Catherine flew away. and the newlyweds began to get used to family life. Wade turned out to be very loving, caring. He tried to help in everything and even came to work. I really want us to have a baby boy. That's why I have to deal with the affairs of the firm. After all, when you give birth, you'll need to stay home for a while, and that's where I'll fill in for you. Lorraine saw nothing wrong in it and was grateful to fate for such an understanding spouse. Wade grasped everything almost on the fly, and very soon he could easily help with contracts, payments, or other organizational issues of the company. One morning, when they were about to leave for work, Lorraine staggered and struggled to her feet, grabbing her husband's hand. Wade picked her up and immediately carried her to the couch. Then, laying her down, asked fearfully, "What's wrong? You're white as chalk. Aren't you feeling well?" Lorraine really hadn't been feeling well for a few days now. It was especially common in the mornings, but she tried to hide it from her husband, citing merely fatigue. "Don't worry, honey," she tried to smile. "I've been feeling a little dizzy lately." Wade, a change in his face, kissed her hand and said quietly, "Is it just me, or are we expecting an heir?" A co-worker of mine at a previous job had exactly these symptoms. Afterward, Anna gave birth to beautiful twins. He kissed his wife. "So you're not going to any work today?" Wade suggested cheerfully. "And if you have any serious questions, I'll call you. Get some rest. One more thing. I need to make sure that my assumptions about the pregnancy are justified. Oh, for God's sake, don't buy any of those fancy pregnancy tests. I don't believe in them. I'm going to call a friend of mine tonight. We used to serve together. Now he's a gynecologist at one of those private clinics. He'll take a look at you." Lorraine, trusting her husband completely, she went for her checkup the next day. It didn't even bother her that the so-called private clinic was a small medical facility in an apartment building with shabby walls, doors, and benches in the hallways. Lorraine was sure that Wade wouldn't advise her badly, so she paid no attention to anything. Alexander, the doctor her husband had made an appointment with, turned out to be a rather good-natured and open-minded man. After examining Lorraine, he reported cheerfully, "Well, can I say? You are about to become a mommy to a beautiful baby boy or baby girl. Quite a normal pregnancy. I'm sorry, but you're not 18. You need to take care to carry it carefully so that there are no complications. Therefore, complete rest and no stress and nervous breakdowns." In the evening, my husband returned with a huge bouquet of flowers and from the threshold joyfully reported, "I already know everything. Sashka called me and told me the good news. Soon I will be a father." Approaching Lorraine, he handed her the bouquet and continued, "I love you very much, and I want our baby to be born healthy. That's why I think you should spend more time at home. I figured it all out pretty well, so it lets you rest and I'll take care of things in the company. And if there's anything I don't understand, I'll be sure to call you." Lorraine was so pleased that now there was someone to take care of her that she kissed her husband and said affectionate, "You're a good girl." "Of course you are, especially since I don't doubt you at all. This is our family business, and you have every right to manage it." At that moment, Lorraine had no idea what a foolish thing she was doing. As soon as she entrusted her husband with the entire management of the business, he began to diligently collect dirt on her father-in-law. His main goal was to remove by any means the father of the company, Alex Patrick, and Lorraine partially he managed to achieve this quite quickly. All cleverly thought out. Wade, through a front man transferred to the police, collected dirt. Alex Patrick was arrested and detained in another part of the country. A criminal case was opened. Lorraine did not understand what to do, how to help her father. She learned about what had happened from Catherine. She said into the phone, sobbing, "Laura, I don't know what to do. My father was taken to prison for some kind of fraud. He couldn't have. You know, there's something wrong. Help me. He's in poor health. He can't survive in prison." Lorraine didn't know what she could do to help him, and she was ready to go. But when her husband returned from work, he was able to convince her not to. Quite confidently, he said, "So Lorraine, what are you doing? In your position is forbidden such moves and nervousness. You want us to have a healthy baby, don't you? Trust me, I will do everything possible and impossible to get your father out." Lorraine trusted her husband completely and waited for him to solve the inexplicable problems that had arisen from nowhere. Wade told her almost every day about what he was doing to make it happen, and she naively believed it all. Believed he wanted to help her father. Believed he loved her. Believed he dreamed of having a baby. He took such good care of her. Every time he came home from work, he'd take her for a walk, and he'd walk beside her. He would caress her belly and say, "When the baby is born, our mommy will be better. Don't be sad, right? While I daddy will work, walk, play, and wait for me, right? By the way, Sashka, your doctor, having learned about what happened, said that you should definitely take light sedatives. I bought some, and you can take them from today." Lorraine felt safe around her husband. He always tried to support her and shield her from any problems. At least, that's how it seemed to her. Lorraine didn't know how she would have gotten through all of this if it hadn't been for Wade and Amber, who called every day wondering how she was doing. After taking the sedative, Lorraine actually became calmer about everything. She found herself wanting to sleep more and more often, and she trusted her husband completely. Her husband reissued all the documents to himself, and Lorraine began to prepare for motherhood with pleasure. She looked at catalogs of baby furniture and things, imagining how she would swaddle, put to bed, and feed the baby. Lorraine enjoyed her situation and was anxious to find out who she was going to have. But her husband said that on the doctor's recommendation it was too early to do a checkup. She agreed, as always. Everything went on as usual. Wade was engaged in the affairs of the company, and Lorraine sat at home, reading, walking, and preparing to become a mom. It all came crashing down in an instant. One night, Wade didn't come home from work. He didn't answer his cell phone, even though Lorraine called almost every half hour. Determined to share her worries with her friend, she dialed Amber's number. But Amber was also unavailable. Lorraine didn't sleep much all night, and when Wade showed up on her doorstep in the morning, she couldn't help herself. "How could you do this to me?" "I was worried. I called you, and you didn't pick up. Did something happen at work?" He, as if not noticing her, went into the room, and pulling out a large traveling suitcase, began to throw his things into it. "Where are you going?" "On a business trip." "Did something happen?" Lorraine asked in a panic, uncomprehending. He turned around, and it was a completely different person. Not an affectionate, loving husband, but an aggressive, angry stranger. Walking almost right up to her and looking straight into her eyes, he hissed rather than spoke. "I don't love you and never have. I just slept with your friend Amber. She's the one who gave me this great plan to take over the farm. Thank her. I am now the full owner of your branch, and your father, as your main competitor, is behind bars. The deal's done, and I have nothing more to do with you. I'm out of here. I'm out of here." At that moment, Lorraine wasn't thinking about her lost firm. She was confused and only asked timidly, "What about our baby? We're having a baby, aren't we?" As she approached the door, Wade tossed the suitcase and literally jumped up to her. "What baby? Are you stupid? I never thought a woman could be so easily fooled about being pregnant. You're supposed to sense something unusual." Grabbing his things, he ran out into the street, and Lorraine stood on the doorstep at a loss, thinking that everything that had happened was like a dream. She decided to make sure it wasn't a lie, so she called her friend. She didn't pick up the phone for a long time, and then she answered dismissively. Lorraine realized that everything her husband had said was true. Taking a full chest of air, she asked, "Tell me, why did you do this to me? What did I do to you? I've always helped and supported you." Amber was silent for a couple minutes, then suddenly spoke. "Why do you ask? Your father once seduced my mother, and after a couple dates he left her pregnant. That bastard didn't just dump her for fear she'd tell someone. He fired her from her job. You have no idea how my mother raised me alone. While you were bathed in love and affection, my mother took on any job, cleaning floors in the entrances, trading at the market, holding me next to her in a stroller. Do you know when all day long, in the rain or sun, you sit in a baby stroller while your mother trades? So I decided that what is legally yours should be mine. A husband, a business, a quiet life. That's mine now, sorry girlfriend." "But we were supposed to have a baby," Lorraine said quietly. Her friend laughed loudly into the phone and, calming down, said, "You're naive. What pregnancy? Have you even taken a test? Fool, go to the drugstore. And then maybe you'll realize that Wade is a con artist and was able to scam you perfectly. And your gynecologist is his best friend." She hung up, and Emily stood in the middle of the room. "Don't believe what's happening." In an instant, all the family happiness, the business, the friendships had burst like a balloon. One thing she couldn't believe was that the pregnancy was false. Lorraine had not been feeling well all this time, and all the symptoms were similar to those of pregnancy. She could not even think that her beloved, unique and best husband had been putting some poisonous substance in her food all this time. Without knowing it, she decided to buy a test after all, continuing to believe that she was pregnant. When she saw the one bar that said there was no baby, she collapsed. The world around her collapsed all at once in an instant. The father is in jail. She's not pregnant. The husband left for a mistress, and the business is gone. Lorraine was a very emotional person. Like a madwoman, she walked out of the gate and slowly walked towards the river. At that moment, her thoughts were of only one thing, that she could not live anymore, and had no right to. Standing on the very edge of the bridge, she was ready to jump down, having solved all problems in one fell swoop. But suddenly she heard a painfully familiar voice. "Lorraine, can't you do it? You have your whole life ahead of you. Especially if you do it, I'll have to do the same. After all, I love you and I can't live without you." She turned around and saw the same guy in the wheelchair. He was smiling so good-naturedly that Lorraine couldn't help but extend her hand in return for his. So they walked away from the bridge, holding each other's hands. Already sitting on a bench in the park, Stephen, as the boy's name was, asked, "I can't understand. I mean, you were so in love getting married. Not even a year later, and you were ready to jump off a bridge. Do you have arms? Do you have legs?" "I don't." "What's wrong?" Lorraine sat silently staring at one point, and Stephen continued, "You know, I used to play sports. I used to get certificates, cups. I was going to get married. It seemed like everything was just like people, and even better. But when I got this injury, My whole life changed in an instant. My fiancée immediately found another healthy man and jumped out and got married. I lost my job. My mother had 3 kids besides me, and I became a burden around her neck, just like you were thinking of ending my misery like this. But imagine, it was you who saved me. Yes, you came to the village, and when I saw you, I almost went crazy. I thought, here she is, my one and only. I immediately found out who you were and who you came to see, and I started to watch for you at every corner. You can't imagine. I couldn't eat, drink, or sleep. All I could think about was you. He paused, looked at Lorraine, and then added, I don't even know how I decided to follow you into town. I'm a countryman. I believe what they say. I picked up your wreath on the river. So it was fate, I decided then, and followed you. I get an invalidity pension. I had a stash, so I used it to rent a small room on the outskirts. I sat in front of your office for days and watched when I found out you were getting married. I thought I'd go crazy, but I decided to fight it. So I came to the restaurant. I guess I shouldn't have insisted when you kicked me out. I see you weren't happy anyway. Suddenly Lorraine turned around, tears in her eyes. After staring intently at Stephen for a minute, she suddenly walked over and hugged him. I'm sorry, please. I was wrong. You seem to be the only person who hasn't abandoned me. They talked for a long time that evening, sitting on a bench in the park and at the bar. Really wish they hadn't broken up, despite his physical condition. The guy was somehow very loyal and reliable, which she was convinced of once again just a few days later. It took a lot of money to hire a lawyer for her father, and when she decided to mortgage the house, Stephen suggested she move into his room for Claire. It was a wild existence at first. The queue in the morning to go to the bathroom because of neighbors' water cuts, and sometimes a complete lack of money for food. But Stephen was always able to comfort her. He scraped together some temporary income. He even started teaching Lorraine how to earn money on the internet. He kept his own blog. It was interesting for Lorraine. She picked it up quickly and easily. It was great to have such a great mentor, her roommate. Seeing them sitting on nothing but cheap pasta every time, the neighbor once suggested, here's what I've been thinking, friends. We're in need of a dispatcher at the cab company. Why don't you, Lorraine, take the job? It's not a dusty job. I'll give you a hint. Lorraine agreed without hesitation. All the more reason to work from home, without going anywhere. Stephen began to fix electronics at home, and things went much better for them. In a couple of months, they were able to rent a separate apartment, which they were very happy about. Claire never once thought of Wade during that time. One day, though, she was brought back to the past by Lenka. She had called out of the blue, and after asking how Lorraine was doing, had spoken quickly. I don't think anything of me. I don't talk to Amber anymore, and she doesn't call me. She and Wade are birds of a different stripe now, spending your money left and right. They go overseas almost every other month. They got a fancy car, a house in the country. Lorraine interrupted her friend, asking her not to talk about her ex. We're divorced, and I don't care what he's doing right now. If that's all, I'm begging you, don't call. Lorraine hung up the phone, deciding for herself that there was no more room in her life for friends. The most important thing to her was to help her dad in any way she could. She'd heard from him several times in the meantime, and she could sense that he was having a hard time there. If her father were closer, Claire could go on a date with him, but it was impossible for her to travel that far. At first, Catherine called her, and she told her that her father was having a hard time in prison. She said that the prisoners, having learned that he was a businessman, created inhumane conditions for him, demanding that his relatives send them packages. Catherine, who had never worked under her father, had no intention of looking for a job. She was only trying to beg Lorraine for money. She was not interested in the fact that the money received as collateral for the house went to the lawyer, and it had to be returned. Realizing that there was nothing to expect from her stepdaughter, Catherine stopped calling, and even when she dialed the number to find out about her father, just did not pick up the phone. One thing that made Lorraine happy was that Stephen was always there. She found herself thinking that she was madly in love with him and was ready to be there for him, no matter what difficulties. He was a real man, tender, affectionate, caring. Next to him, she felt happy and protected. Of course, they did not have wealth, but they managed to pay for housing, to live on something, and even send help to Dad after Lorraine began working as a dispatcher in a com. She and Stephen had a dream, which after a while they were able to realize. The same neighbor in the apartment helped. He, through friends, found an inexpensive car with manual controls, and as soon as the car was registered to Stephen, arranged for him to work in a taxicab company. Laura was overjoyed. After all, Stephen had long dreamed of driving. With work became much easier, and they even talked about a possible trip to Lorraine's father. But for now, it was just plans. They needed a decent amount of money for round-trip tickets, plus something to carry. Stephen was ready to work around the clock, but Lorraine, taking care of him, didn't give orders if she saw he was tired. The guy was angry, but very quickly withdrew, realizing that Lorraine does it for his sake. One day, when Steve was just getting on the line after a day off, an order came in. The caller was curt and demanded that the car be delivered as soon as possible. He gave an address that Lorraine recognized immediately. She recognized the caller's voice, too. It was Wade, ordering a cab to Amber's house. He thought he was talking to a regular dispatcher and kept demanding a car as soon as possible, promising to send one right away. Lorraine radioed Stephen. "This is an emergency order. No one's available. It's my ex-husband, so no problem. It's just business, nothing personal. We need the money. I'll give you the address." It was dark in the car, so Amber and Wade in the backseat didn't recognize Stephen. The passenger grinned when he saw the badge on the window that said he was a disabled driver, and before he sat down, he turned to Stephen. "Hey man, I hope you're not taking us to a robbery. It's kind of creepy driving with a coworker behind the wheel." Stephen, without turning around, replied in a calm voice, "Don't be afraid. It's not the first day I've been driving. I haven't hurt anyone." All the way, the couple discussed how to successfully pull off another case. This time, Lorraine's ex-husband was supposed to pass himself off as some missing son of a very famous banker in town. Before they left town, they discussed in detail the video recorder that every car in their taxicab fleet was equipped with. It recorded what was happening in the cabin and in their country village. And after driving away, Stephen immediately told Lorraine everything in detail. Lorraine knew the man in question in absentia. Her father had once crossed paths with him in business. And on the same day, she took the tape to the businessman. Valerie George was the banker's name. When he saw it, he said indignantly, "What a bunch of impertinent people. They know where the sore spot is. Thank you very much. I still believe that my son is alive, and I would have bought such a thing. What can I do to thank you?" he asked. Lorraine, after a moment's silence, told him about her father and asked him to help if possible. Yes. I've heard about his own son-in-law setting it up, but I didn't think that scoundrel would take it out on me now. I'll try to help George," promised Valerie, taking the coordinates from Lorraine. A few days later, a phone call rang in Lorraine and Stephen's apartment. What was her surprise when she saw the very same banker on the doorstep. "Are you?" she asked confusedly. He smiled and said, "What surprises you so much? I am accustomed to giving debts to those who help me." "Hey, can I get you some tea?" Lorraine offered, walking inside. She went to put the kettle on. When she returned, she found her guest pale, holding a framed photo. "Where did you get this? And where is this woman now?" he said in a voice trembling with excitement. In the photo was Stephen's mom, holding him small in her arms. Then, calming down a little, Valerie George told him, "I loved that woman madly." In a quiet voice he continued, looking at the photograph. "I loved Ellen very much, but we were young then, and I can't remember what I said or did that made her pack up overnight. While I was at work, she ran away. How many times I looked for her afterward, I never could find her. Now I see this picture. How old is Stephen?" When he heard the answer, he could no longer hold back his tears. "I beg of you, ask him to come now. I'm sure that's my son. I want to see him." As Stephen sat in shock, listening to the love story of this gray-haired, bald gentleman and his mother, he couldn't believe what was happening. Only a small photo that the guest pulled out of his purse pocket of his mom was able to convince Stephen of the reality of what was being said. A few days later, a DNA test conducted confirmed their parentage, and Valerie George, sobbing with happiness, hugged her son. "Everything is already God in the world. One son took away, but gave another," he said. The banker helped to return Lorraine home, where they immediately moved with Stephen. And a couple months later, Valerie George, with a lot of effort, was able to pull Lorraine's father to freedom. But that wasn't all the change. Learning that Stephen's mother lives in the village and raises 3 children alone, Valerie George rushed to his beloved, and although with difficulty, but persuaded her to move to the city. "I have agreed to put Stephen for surgery, and I think it will be better if his family will be close to him," he said, giving a strong argument. Despite the woman's timid resistance, he put them up in his country house. And when Lorraine saw him one day in the hospital, she noticed that he seemed 10 years younger. Valerie George had been a widower for many years, and the appearance of such a noisy company in his quiet den, as he said, completely turned his life upside down. Stephen underwent an operation, and as soon as he began to walk on his own, he and Lorraine applied for a registry office. A criminal case had already been filed against the fraudster, and Amber, along with her lover Wade, went to jail for many years. Stephen and Lorraine's wedding was the noisiest and most beautiful event in town. There were over 100 people invited, but the happiest at this celebration, besides the newlyweds, were of course the parents. Alex Patrick, who returned to his hometown, though without Catherine, who found a young lover in the northern land, smiled happily. He held out his filled glass and said that he never thought he'd be related. "Thank you, Valerie George, for getting me out. I thought I'd be behind bars for the rest of my life." Valerie George hugged the embarrassed Emily, Stephen's mother, and said something slyly in her ear. "I would have gotten you out anyway. After all, someone has to be a witness at our wedding in a month." He looked fondly at the woman. "Let's toast to the young people," someone exclaimed. They were already hanging on his arms from both sides. Let's go. Now Lorraine and Stephen will kiss, and we must shout, 'Bitter, come on,' whoever's loudest." As he was leaving, he turned to those seated and said in a happy voice, "Well, Alex, Patrick, while our grandchildren will give birth, I'm still growing my own 3. My kids will be cooler than the young ones." The happy trio left, and Lorraine and Stephen, who were watching from the side, happily twirled in a dance. The wife reluctantly packed her things to leave her husband, but hearing the voices of her husband and mother-in-law, she hid. Carol sat in the stall at her workplace and fell asleep due to the change in weather. She wanted to sleep all the time. The bell rang and a customer appeared near the window. "A scone, please, and 2 poppy seed muffins," the man asked. Carol handed him the purchases and sat back in her seat. Despite such a simple job, she would rather have something physical than sit like this all day, pecking her nose. The customers were good in the morning and from 3 o'clock on, but the rest of the time the woman entertained herself with embroidery or reading books. Carol remembered the 5 years of hard study she had spent at the institute. And now, years later, it turned out that higher education had no meaning for her. After studying, the girl went to work as an engineer at a factory. It closed after 3 years. Carol was disappointed in her future for several years and realized that only in big cities education mattered. The provinces only needed teachers, and for jobs that were distributed in advance to family and friends. Carol didn't stop there. She tried a change of specialty. She finished courses and became a landscape designer. During that period, she met her husband, Daniel. She had high hopes then, which again were not realized. There were few people in the city who were willing to pay specialists to design landscaping projects for plots and gardens. The company promised Carol that they would have projects from the city and possibly the regional administration. But time passed, and apart from the occasional order, nothing happened. Carol urged Daniel to go with her to the regional city, but her fiancé was strongly attached to his parents and didn't want to live in the city. So at almost 32, it seemed to Carol that her life was over. Yes, she married Daniel. They sold Carol's grandmother's old house, added the money given to them as a wedding gift, and took out a loan in her husband's name, as Carol had no official job at the time. Carol's husband did not have a college degree and did not particularly aspire to one. He worked in a warehouse where his mother had gotten him a job many years ago through her connections. Carol tried many things. She even worked at school. But since the girl was adamantly opposed to the system that killed children in schools, she didn't last long there. If someone had told me that I would just waste 5 years of my life, she sighed and put the book aside, I wouldn't have studied anywhere at all. You can learn everything online now. As a child, Carol loved inventing things. Her father taught high school drafting and her mother worked as a doctor. Her parents decided that engineering education would suit Carol, and the girl herself entered the institute with high hopes. Carol dreamed of getting some experience and entering graduate school in a big city, but she quickly had to come back down to earth. She didn't want to stay to teach at the institute. She was interested in practicing. But her parents didn't have the money for her to go where the research centers were located, and counting on a grant at her own institute was pointless because of the low salaries of teachers for many years. In the end, never having become an inventor, she sat in a stall and did not understand what to do next. After a 15 job at the store, Carol found a rather promising place. Of course, the salary wasn't great, but the 8 to 4 schedule with Sunday off suited her. Carol, hi, came from the other side of the window. How are you doing? Why are you so sad? Hi, Kyle, she sighed. What's there to be happy about? I'll probably never get out of this hole. But it depends on how you look at it, Carol's former classmate replied seriously. The glass is half full or empty. That's something only you can determine. Sometimes Carol envied Kyle. He was a head saint in high school too. His family was very poor. His alcoholic father had drained his mother until he died. And in 11th grade, the kid's mother fell and was left disabled. Kyle's 2 older sisters left for more promising places, and he stayed to look after Elena Alexeyevna. Kyle, like a mom, thoughtfully asked Carol, take her a visitor. You will. Thank you. He took his bread and a small package from Carol. Let's keep our spirits up, or you'll find happiness around the corner and you won't be ready for it. I wish to God I could say that, sighed her classmate. I'll probably be carried out of this stall. The meeting with Constantine upset Carol even more, and beat, and so forever. But even earlier, Carol decided for the umpteenth time to talk to her husband today. She was sure he wouldn't agree to move from here to somewhere else. Still, the woman decided to give it a try. What do I want, she asked herself aloud. But I'll start with a simple one. Do I want a lot of money? Unequivocally, no. I want enough so that I don't have to think about not having a penny for bread in a week. I do not need an expensive car or a palace in principle. I need money as a tool for living, not for power and manipulating others. Let's move on. Family. I want children madly. I don't think there's any point in dragging it out any longer. Daniel and I have been married for about 5 years now. We've had enough to live for ourselves. The more Carol reasoned, the more she felt that her problem wasn't even the job. It was a matter of fulfillment. She was suffering from the fact that she couldn't find herself on the outside. Carol saw that she was not living her life. She wasn't realizing her potential at all. It's your own fault, her mother-in-law often reprimanded her. If you'd worked at school, everything would have been fine. But no, everyone's happy, but you're not. You're special. Carol put the book aside and surfed the internet again. She loved videos about cold core, single crystal synthesis, and other things that were recognized as pseudoscience. Although it had been proven more than once that it all worked in practice, people's consciousness hadn't yet reached those types of energy. If only we had such a device, we wouldn't need to build dangerous nuclear power plants. A little box in every yard and everyone would have electricity, Carol whispered, and began to draw something on the paper. Give me 2 bottles of Budweiser beer. Carol's slightly gruff voice brought Carol back to her senses. She handed over the bread, smiled crookedly. She didn't feel like saying anything back when the bread was already cheaper. The man didn't wait for the saleswoman's reaction and went into action himself. You've got a nerve, all their own. And bread costs as much as abroad. Carol shrugged her shoulders. She didn't want to get into a discussion. She couldn't influence the pricing in any way. And it was not only pointless, but even dangerous to take all the blame. The customer left, but Carol's mood had completely soured. She started to go home. It was an hour before the stall closed. Carol felt sad again. She dialed her husband. Hi. How are you doing? She asked Daniel. Will you be there today as usual? No, I'll be late, maybe a couple hours, he sighed. There's a shipment coming in late today, and we have to take it in. Carol wasn't in much of a mood to go home. Everything was boring. If she could get away from this life, she'd do it. Tangled in her coat. Despite the wind, she still decided to walk. The beginning of April was cold. There was still snow in some places. Carol walked toward the river. Her hands were cold, but for some reason she was drawn there. The woman approached the bank. Carol suddenly shuddered. Are you doing something? Glaring at him with her eyes. Thinking, he answered calmly. See, he pointed with his hand at the ice. Why does it float? Well, because water expands when it freezes and becomes lighter. Carol answered at once. Why does it expand? He sighed. No one knows. No one has been able to see how water molecules rearrange themselves into a crystalline structure. Just a moment, and the water in front of us is no longer water, but ice. Is this a matter of life and death for you? Carol tried to make a joke. Yes, Kyle answered seriously. I've been working on an invention for several years now. I want to create a substance that would restore the structure of Mom's hip bone. What does ice have to do with it? Carol couldn't understand. You want to put it on the sore spot? No, I want a liquid that can expand when it hits the bone tissue, and thus create a porous bone structure. After my mom's fracture, all of her bones are flattened. Honestly, I can't even imagine how that would be possible, Carol thought. If you inject this fluid into the muscle, the body temperature will prevent it from changing structure. Therefore, this fluid in its original state must exist at a higher temperature. His eyes lit up. I've already gotten it, but I don't have time to inject it yet. It's already getting viscous in the syringe. You amaze me, Carol whispered in amazement. But I still don't understand how it can be done. The idea is this: I inject a certain substance, and at body temperature it becomes viscous and expands. I need to inject it near the problem bone. Then this substance will lift the bone tissue a little bit, and keep it that way for a certain period of time. The bone tissue regenerates quickly, and a new healthy area appears. About a week to 2 weeks later, the substance breaks down into water and other safe elements. But if you look at it all theoretically, Carol lit up, then you need an inhibitor to slow down the solidification of this substance ahead of time. Although I still don't believe it can be done. The conversation with Kyle was a real jolt to the woman. What Kyle was doing seemed more miraculous than real to her. But let's say such a substance existed and could be administered. She pondered on the way home. How would it determine that it needed to work on bone and not other tissue? Carol got home and began to do her chores. But Kyle and his idea never left her mind. She was grasping at it like a straw, you might say. It had been so long since Carol's mind had solved such complex problems that the woman had taken a keen interest in the whole thing. Late in the afternoon, her husband returned. Carol's eyes were burning. She wanted to tell him everything. "Daniel, do you remember my classmate Kyle?" She spoke quickly. "Well, he's doing something so interesting right now. He wants to invent a drug to cure his mother." What a load of crap. Daniel made a disgruntled face. He's had her for over 10 years with a fractured femoral neck. "People can't get up. She's gonna die, you idiot." Why is he an idiot? The wife took offense. Maybe he can do something. Many inventions were created by amateurs, not professionals. Because he's an idiot. The man said unkindly, "I've seen your Kyle. It's written all over his face that he's a worthless man." "I don't agree with you," the wife countered. "Kyle doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he works. He's a decent man." "He's lazy." Daniel waved his hand. "Don't spoil the mood. I don't want to talk about this garbage." Daniel sat down at the table. Not that Daniel was any different from anyone else, but in his mind he was a real man. Of course, everyone in the neighborhood knew that Kyle was taking care of his mother. Many people found such things surprising, but didn't like it. Daniel himself had also lived across town with his mother before he got married. Carol and Daniel were able to buy a home inexpensively in this area of town that was considered the most up and coming. "Daniel, let's go somewhere else." Carol couldn't take it anymore. "I can't live here anymore." "I'm not leaving my mother, I warned you right away," he replied. "Maybe she'll move in with us later too." Carol tried again. "No, she wants to stay here." And Carol, "Well, don't you start. Go to work at the school, and your ardor will diminish immediately." In the beginning of their acquaintance, Carol felt like she was behind Daniel like a stone wall. But after a few years, she began to notice that her husband was not inclined to talk openly or to change. He was a very closed, conservative man, even though he didn't realize it. Carol suffered greatly from this. She could be called sociable, and at first the girl was sure that she could find a common language with Daniel. But time showed that she wouldn't. "Okay, Daniel, if you don't want to leave here, then let's plan a baby. Where else can we wait?" she raged. "That's something you and I will discuss later," he replied coldly. "Carol, will you let me have a quiet evening? I'm tired." There was nothing left for Carol to do but forget everything and do some business. How often do young people fall in love? They think their love will last forever. But time passes, and both begin to notice that they have not chosen the most suitable partner. And it becomes scary. Why is it so? Everything was great in the beginning. Unfortunately, each of us enters marriage not with a real person, but with our own expectations. So when our expectations are not met, we begin to see our partner as he or she really is. And of course, the reality is very different from the desired reality. Someone begins to work on himself, and the relationship improves, or people break up. But such a minority. The rest try their best to maintain the standards imposed on them and go on with their lives. That's what Carol thought, that now she would have to die with Daniel on the same day. Carol went to sleep again, such an impenetrable darkness enveloping her. She cast a glance at her husband and shuddered. He seemed foreign and distant to her. The next day was warmer. Carol didn't even turn on the heater. It began as it always did, first the receiving of goods, and then the customers crowded around her stall. Carol tried to smile at them, but she wasn't in the mood. She saw a picture in front of her that she had taken a wrong turn. Her parents didn't get involved in her daughter's life, and she couldn't talk to them. They, too, held views that were considered normal in society. By the end of the day, Carol realized that she was dying to talk to Kyle. But he was coming in every other day for bread. He wasn't officially working anywhere. He couldn't leave his mother all day. He worked part-time, did odd jobs, hired out to neighbors. None of his older sisters wanted to take on such a burden. So the man got by as best he could. The phone rang. Daniel said he was staying at his mother's house tonight. Carol knew the routine very well. Daniel had a difficult temper. He couldn't calm down for a long time, so after such conversations with his wife, he often spent the night at his mother's house, so as not to bring the matter to conflict. Perhaps it was Carol's own fault. If she caught fire, she couldn't stop until she got some result. And since it seemed to the woman that her happiness depended on moving to another city, or having a baby, she wanted to see this through to the end. "All right," the wife replied through tears. "Daniel," as she wanted to say something to him but refrained. "I'll miss you." It had been a lonely evening. It drove Carol further into a state of hopelessness. She felt like tearing up and throwing up. Maybe get a job in the area. An idea came to her mind. I won't be able to take it anytime soon. Daniel will never leave his mother. Daniel's father had died a year and a half ago. Now he was all the more reluctant to even think about another city. He was fine here. His mother was alone and needed looking after. Only unlike Kyle, Daniel felt like he was acting like a grown man. "I'm doing something wrong," Carol sighed. "It's like I'm walking in a vicious circle. There's no way out." It seemed she saw a dead end in every area of her life. The only thing that occurred to her then was to take a few days off for a few days off for a few days and just not think about anything. The next day was Friday, and the woman called the landlord first thing in the morning. He agreed to give her a couple days. Carol rejoiced when she saw her classmate. "But how are you doing? How are your experiments going?" "Well, some things are," he reported cheerfully. "Honestly, there isn't enough time." "I'd so like to see it," Carol admitted. "I can't believe it's possible. How does this substance reach the bone?" "Hey, I certainly don't understand it myself," the man shrugged. "It's just that if it stays in the tissue, it starts breaking down right away. I did experiments on my dog. Rex ran outside one night. He was mauled by other dogs. After some time, I tried to inject him near the sore spot, but there was no result. He healed all by himself." "Then why do you think it works on bone tissue?" The classmate couldn't figure it out. "And that's where the same Rex helped me again," laughed the man. "Only now that restless dog was being pounded by someone. Anyway, he came back with a broken paw. I gave him shots, didn't even think anything would work. But to my surprise, after 3 days he could walk. I touched his leg and the bone had fused. I gave him another injection. And within a week he was running like before. I don't have lab equipment, so I can't tell you exactly how it all works. But right now it seems to me that this substance first expands the bone tissue and then absorbs into it, promoting regeneration. You want to come over and I'll show you?" Kyle offered and started to pay because a couple more people came up behind him. "Are you going to be home tomorrow?" Carol shouted out from the stall. Kyle nodded affirmatively and waved at her. "Despite the problems, I find Kyle's life much more interesting than mine." Carol sighed and began serving customers. And there was something about it all. Perhaps Carol's passion for scientific knowledge, an interest in learning something new. But she did go to Kyle's house the next day. Carol talked to her classmate's mother. She had seen her years ago, and it was obvious now how much the woman was suffering. Kyle dressed her, taking her for a walk outside. "So, shall we go see it?" He winked cheerfully at his guest. "I'll warn you right away, my place is a mess." They entered the workshop. Yes, it was a place of sheer chaos, but it made Carol's blood boil. How happy was she to see all those scattered tools, flasks, coasters, checks, bits of different metals. Wow, her eyes lit up. "Kyle, you've got a real lab in here. I'm the one with the mess right now. And when I start the process, it's sterile clean here on the table." The man led her over to a very strange setup. There were some tubes connected there, vessels through which some kind of gas was apparently being pumped. "And how does all this work?" she asked in amazement. "Is it something organic?" "Well, of course, no hydrocarbons around here." Kyle smiled and began to explain to Carol how his device worked. But that was only the first part. The main part was the substance it produced. That was where all the value was. "Have you tried injecting your mom with it yet?" Carol asked cautiously. Carol was afraid. "I'm scared too," he sighed. He had recently picked up 2 stray dogs with broken paws. "So now I'm treating them." Wow caught her guest's breath. "It's working." She kept her eyes on her host. "Yes," he sighed. "But I want to add one more component. My intuition tells me the effectiveness might increase that way." "Kyle, have you told your mom about your experiments?" Carol inquired. "She wants to try it," he replied seriously. "Mom is already very tired of her disability. I feel very sorry for her, too." "Yes, the case is too delicate. There are great risks. Little chance of anything? Maybe such a drug would work for dogs, but not for humans," sighed a classmate. "That's the problem," Kyle supported her. "It's not like I'm a scientist. I don't have that kind of knowledge. Sure, I've reread tons of books, even consulted with some experts. But I can't say out loud that it works." Kyle: "Well, if it does work, what then?" Curiosity was shared by Carol. "But I'm not Henry Ford. I don't have a wife, Clara, who supported him no matter what. And the light saw the world's first automobile," the man sighed. "But if it does come out that way, I'll be happy for those people who will have the opportunity to have real bones instead of titanium bones." "So what?" "A lot of handicapped people will walk normally." Carol walked home. She wanted to cry and rejoice at the same time. Why cry? Because people like Kyle never asked for anything from anyone. They were altruistic and tried to bring something to people at the expense of themselves. Well, joy was a natural feeling from the fact that among the heart-centered people were these fools like her classmate. Daniel and his kind would never put such simpletons in line with themselves. It would be beneath their dignity. But it was Kyle, not him, who sought to improve the lives of all mankind. He used his last dime to buy the necessary drugs, assembling rig after rig until he got exactly what he wanted. These are the kind of people who just move science forward. They're real men with pumped-up brains, not bodies. The latter didn't matter much, except for the physical labor. There were many, many things going through Carol's mind. She, too, wanted to quit everything and do something, to invest her energies, to dream that something would work out, instead of sitting in her stall and being angry at life. Carol was in no mood at all, so she didn't call her husband. She felt a strong resentment toward him. Compared to Kyle, he looked retarded. His outlook on life showed that he didn't have much intelligence in him. She distracted herself with household chores. Her husband came home from work in the evening. He was kind of wooden. "Daniel, is something wrong?" His wife walked up to him. "You look exhausted." "Yeah, there was trouble at work today," he tossed off and went into the other room. Carol didn't bother to bother him, but there was pain in her soul again. Daniel seemed like a complete stranger to her. The weekend flew by quickly and Carol went back to work. The morning didn't go well. First, some grandfather got into a fight with her, always telling her that she'd stolen from him. In his opinion, she should have taken half as much bread from him. "Grandpa, do I have to add the rest of you out of my own pocket?" Carol answered him. "You're smoking everyone here," yelled an old man outside the stall. "Whatever price you want, that's what you charge." "Old age is no fun," said an elderly woman nearby. "It takes away everything, even your mind." The grandfather kept yelling, threatening to report him to the police when the saleswoman stopped paying attention to him. "Hello, Carol." The longtime acquaintance approached the stall with a wry smile. She had no idea how much Carol hated her, and the feeling was mutual. "Hello, Lucy." The woman replied calmly. As always, she did not want to prolong the conversation. She and Lucy had once worked together at the school. The latter stayed there, worked her way up to head teacher, and thought she had become a celestial. Well, since Carol was openly opposed to the school system, she was laughed at by the likes of Lucy. They made a good profit at the school, with some of the curtain money going into their pockets. And the rates for expensive gifts were set at the beginning of the school year. "I heard you and Daniel divorced." Lucy lowered her voice. "Why? Were they so out of character?" "What the hell is that?" Carol's eyes flashed. "We're fine, we're still together. But that chick he keeps driving around in his car is nothing like you." Lucy laughed out loud. I heard it was someone from his work. It's not like his mom gave him a girl. Is there anything else you need? Or is that it? Carol tossed it to her. Sorry, I got a lot of work to do. Yeah, she said dismissively. The truth hurts. She grabbed the bag of muffins and walked away. Of course, Lucy's words had hurt Carol. She trusted her husband. Yes, he was occasionally late for work, but that didn't mean anything. Idiot, Carol whispered. You'd better look at yourself, stolen money. Daddy's pockets are howling. No matter how much Carol urged herself not to think about the incident, all sorts of thoughts popped into her head. Meanwhile, Daniel was having a serious conversation. It was break time, and he went into the back room to see Lenora. The woman pretended not to pay attention to him. Daniel approached her, wanting to hug her. Don't touch me. She waved him away. I told you it's over between us. Len, stop it. I love you, he said in a gentle voice. I broke up with my ex, she sobbed. Are you still living with her? I just don't know how to file for divorce so that I can get the house back. I paid the loan on it, the man sighed. You wouldn't even listen to me yesterday, Lenora said. I don't care, the mistress didn't want to reconcile. You promised me that she wouldn't be in my life anymore. She sobbed. I can tell you that again, he confirmed. You give me time. When Daniel had met Carol, he'd thought he'd found his ideal. The girl seemed smart, reliable. Of course, the young man had serious relationships before her, but he had not yet decided to marry. Daniel always considered himself one of the most real men. When he was young, he enthusiastically pumped his muscles. In his opinion, he wasn't stupid either. In short, the perfect man. After a year of married life, Carol and her high-mindedness began to annoy him. Daniel didn't want to waste his time with such nonsense. All this talk about life, about how to make it better for everyone. It wasn't for him. Well, and then, about 3 years later, when Carol had developed a bent on moving to the city, the young man finally realized that he'd done something wrong. It wasn't Daniel's policy to admit his mistakes. A real man couldn't make mistakes. But a couple more months passed, and Daniel clearly realized that something had to be done. He'd had his eye on one at work a long time ago. Lenora was living with Wade at the time. She was a beautiful and hard-working woman, so Daniel began to pursue her. They hid at first. Daniel had a car, so it was easy. Then Daniel started making jealous scenes to get his lover to break up with her roommate. Basically nothing new. A word or two about Daniel's mother. It's not that Tracy hated Carol. No, it's just that she'd always felt she was the wrong kind of wife for Daniel. Carol wasn't exactly a looker. Her overly skinny body and salt black hair didn't evoke the emotions that usually came from seeing a beautiful woman. And when Tracy learned that her son was looking at Lenora, she didn't mind at all. Carol's fate had been decided behind her back. She'd hoped she and her husband would go to the big city and have children. Lenora clung to her lover, wanting certainty. And for that, Daniel had to go through with the divorce. The sooner the better. The man himself couldn't stand his wife anymore either. She had become repugnant to him. Daniel, in the evening, Carol came up to him and said, I want to talk to you. She was very worried. Not tonight, he objected immediately. Carol, may I? Did you get any sleep tonight? I still can't get over last night. Daniel. I can't take it anymore, she shouted. You're not paying attention to me. What's the matter? It's nothing, he threw coldly. I'm tired. It's not like I'm a robot. I can't take a day off on a whim like you do. Do you love me? The wife asked provocatively. Carol, answer me, did you decide to finish me off today? After all, jumped the husband out of bed and began to dress. Where are you going? Carol rushed to him in tears. To my mother's, at least to sleep at her place. She doesn't nag me as much as you do. He said goodbye and disappeared into the yard. During the night, Carol was restless. The next day in the evening, she decided to drive to her husband's work. She waited till morning. It was gray, unkind. The work was hard. There weren't many people because it was raining. Carol closed her stall and hailed a cab. She tangled herself in her raincoat and waited. Daniel worked until 6. His wife waited for him, stood nearby and watched as her husband came out of the gate, followed by some strange woman. She sat in the front seat and began kissing him passionately. Carol couldn't move. She sat down and cried loudly. The car had long since left and she still couldn't get up. "Daniel," she called her husband an hour later, "we need to have a serious talk with you. I've seen you. So stop making a fool of me." Her husband was silent, disconnecting the phone. Carol tried many more times to dial him, but he blocked her number. "Bastard," Carol screamed. "What a coward you turned out to be. You've never been a real man, only lip service, just shaking your muscles senselessly." Carol was exhausted that night. She hadn't slept much the night before to do anything about it. She took a sedative, fell asleep. She woke up to the phone ringing, her alarm clock going off. She could barely get up. No sooner had she opened her stall than Kyle came rushing toward her on his bike. He looked very excited. "Carol, I did it," he said. "I gave Mom her first shot, and she's feeling better." "Congratulations," she said dryly. She was in so much pain she didn't want to see anyone. "Did something happen to you?" Carol's classmate tossed his bike. "It's nothing much," she said through tears. "It's just that I'm going to be filing for divorce." "Did you and Daniel have a fight?" As if he wanted to be supportive of his friend. "Carol, I can help you with that." "Kyle? With what?" She covered her face with her hands. "Will you make me forget that he has a mistress and that he cheated on me? Here you go, give this to your mom." She held out some buns in a bag. "Come over tonight after work," Kyle suggested. "You need a detached look at all this." Carol didn't say anything back to him, shrugging her shoulders. She just wanted to stop living at that moment. Daniel still didn't answer either. Carol called her parents, explaining everything to them. "Carol, get your things and come and visit us," her mother told her immediately. "How I didn't want your Daniel. He thought too highly of himself." And so he was. Not a man, but a wimp. Can't even admit his betrayal. And Daniel was actually very nervous. That was the real reason he hadn't filed for divorce yet. He didn't want to be seen as a scumbag in other people's eyes. But how to frame his wife? He hadn't figured it out until now. Now everyone would know he had a mistress. At work, they'd somehow managed to keep it quiet until the last moment. Daniel's mother had made up a legend that Lenora was a distant relative of theirs. And so Daniel often gave her a ride home. They never took liberties in public at the warehouse, and they rarely spoke at all. So from this side, Daniel looked like a decent family man and took care of his relatives. Tracy was often late for work. Then the three of them would drive home. Daniel swore the last words at Carol to himself. He really didn't want the gossip. Everything was going according to plan. His mother had promised to help him get rid of his wife. Carol seemed to feel her husband cursing her. She walked toward the house, but then abruptly turned around and headed to visit Kyle. Carol greeted her classmate's mother cheerfully. "It's so good to see you." The guest froze in place. She couldn't believe her eyes. No, Lenora wasn't walking yet, but she looked much better. "Can you imagine? The pains are gone," she reported contentedly. "I was so scared, and Kyle was too. Carol, but what have I got to lose? 5 more years of being in a wheelchair and then going to the other side of the world. I'm still afraid to believe in that miracle." Carol and Kyle walked to the workshop. The man sat down in a chair. He was overwhelmed with emotion, such joy that he couldn't even express it. "Carol, I consulted someone," Kyle began. "True, it's not a doctor, it's a biochemist. But anyway, he told me it's a very promising field. Something like growing bones, only not from stem cells, but from the cells of the bone itself. First, this substance fills the problematic joint. Then it expands the space a little bit and starts to fit into it. This somehow provokes the growth of new cells. I don't even know how to explain it scientifically." "Do you want to continue your experiment?" Carol inquired. "Carol, it seems very promising to me. I'd have to get my mother back on her feet," he sighed. "Serious research takes money, and I don't have any. I'm already denying myself everything to buy everything I need. I even needed high-grade gold for the rig." "But if you get a patent," Carol suggested, "then you could implement your invention." "Who's going to give it to me?" That takes serious research, not knee-jerk like mine. If I could find sponsors. But in our city, it is simply impossible. We either have beggars like me, or businessmen in the market. And these comrades are not interested in their future anyway. They don't even want a better life for their children. They live for one day, just to make more money. And yet Carol had the feeling that something would change. She returned home in high spirits. She felt like her life was making sense to her now. Carol was eager to study with Kyle, and the first thing she wanted to do was contact someone at her institute for advice. One faculty member she had once been good friends with, but that would come later. For now, the woman needed to pack her things and move in with her parents. Carol saw that her husband wasn't home. She rushed into one of the rooms and started packing her bags. The pain came over her again, and she dropped everything and lay down on the bed to calm down. Then she heard a noise. She threw her bag into the closet and hid in the corner behind the curtain. She didn't want to see Daniel so badly that some childish instinct kicked in. Someone was talking at the door, and Carol immediately recognized her mother-in-law and her husband. "Just throw my jewelry in her drawer," Tracy was saying. "And then I'll file a police report. Let them know I suspect her. Your wife turned out to be a thief. I mean, she's been visiting me, and everyone knows it." Carol opened the door, turned on the recording on her phone. The husband and mother-in-law were so startled they couldn't get a word out. "So that's it," Carol angrily threw. "Not only did you scoundrels confuse me, but you also wanted to slander me. But no more. Listen here. Everyone will know what you are and what your son is, and he's no different from you. He's a bastard like you." "Shut your mouth," Daniel lunged at her. "I'll have you now," he swung around. "Everything that happens here is seen by Kyle on his phone. He bugged me." Carol made up a story as she went along. "So any movement you make and the police will be right there." Daniel ran out of the house, followed by his mother. Carol, of course, hadn't heard that Tracy wasn't going to have her son share the house with her, as that was a topic they had discussed before the jewelry was planted. Her mother-in-law's jewelry would become a tool for their blackmail. Carol would then easily give up her share. Daniel thus accomplished two things at once: he got out clean, because now Carol was to blame for the divorce. And secondly, he was taking all the property. He pulled up sharply in front of his mother's yard. She got out and he drove to his mistress. "How I hate you so much," he whispered. "Stupid, you ruined everything." He pounded his fist on the steering wheel. Daniel stepped on the gas. He only had a couple of kilometers to go to get to Lenore. A corner appeared, and Daniel suddenly slammed into a pole at full speed. The car was a pile of metal in an instant. Everything swirled before Daniel's eyes, and he lost consciousness. "No," screamed Tracy Alexandra as her son was overtaken by instant punishment. She walked around with crazy eyes and told everyone how her daughter-in-law had cast a spell on her and Daniel. She wanted to kill him, found a lover, and thought to get rid of my boy that way. How are such people incapable of admitting their guilt? And Tracy Alexandra has always been convinced of her uniqueness. Mistakes are for the weak. That's how she raised her son. He could look down on everyone forever, make fun of others. But there's always a price. Daniel came to. His mother was sitting beside him, crying. She had already argued with all the doctors, demanding that her son be brought back to life. Though she had been warned that if Daniel did regain consciousness, he would most likely remain disabled. "I mean, how's that no walking?" Tracy Alexander jumped up from her chair in the doctor's office. "It's your responsibility to get him on his feet." "But I'm not the Lord God," replied the doctor. "Besides, you can arrange in New York for money to have him operated on. We don't do such complicated operations in our city. There are no such specialists. So it's up to you." Tracy Alexander shouted at the entire hospital, threatening the prosecutor's office. "Come on, bring the prosecutor. I'll show him in what conditions we work. Maybe they will at least raise our salaries." Calmly replied the doctor. Tracy Alexandra was shaking, but she didn't realize that the doctors had already done everything they could. Daniel had survived, and already that could be called a miracle. After a few days, they allowed his mistress to visit the patient. She cried, and then decided to talk to the doctor. "Are you sure that nothing can be done? I beg you, maybe we can find some kind of cure." "Unfortunately, there is no such magic pill," the doctor sighed. "Prepare for the worst. He won't walk. He has serious problems with his spine." The mistress fell to the floor. She hadn't counted on this outcome at all. Lenora found herself in a very difficult position. For almost a week she thought about her future, and then she made a decision. Wade. Hi, she dialed her ex-boyfriend. I'm so sorry, Lenora cried, fake tears. I only love you. Let's get back together. Tracy Alexandra was also thinking hard. She was counting on Lenora in this situation. Daniel would get the house and the divorce. So they already had a place to live, she reasoned. I would visit them from time to time, help her out. The next day at Tracy's work, Alexandra wanted to have a serious talk with Daniel's mistress. Lenora, can I talk to you for a minute? She approached her. My girl, I don't think you're going to have any more problems with housing. You and Daniel can stay at his place or yours. It's just that if you take him in, you can sell the house and pay for the treatment. The doctor said he might get his back working and my boy will at least be able to ride in a wheelchair. Lenora laughed. Tracy Alexandra, you'll have to excuse me, but I can't. Somehow going pale, break Daniel. Lenora, are you abandoning my son? I mean, he loves you so much. Tracy Alexandra. You see, Wade came back to me, she smiled crookedly. So we're living together now. You took him back, Tracy Alexandra whispered. Lenora, how could you do that? And my boy. She sobbed. But Lenora wasn't about to change her plans. As long as Daniel had been healthy, everything had been fine. But now that he was an invalid, why would she want to ruin her life? Loving someone else is important, of course. But you can't love yourself any less. It's always me that comes first for people like Lenora. It was very hard for Tracy Alexandra to admit defeat. Things had spiraled so fast she'd forgotten all about her sister-in-law. But it was getting to her. The few times she'd gotten to Daniel's house, his wife hadn't been home. What am I going to tell her? Tracy Alexandra was working out a plan in her head. It's not like she's going to listen to me. I have to come up with something so she can't say no to me. The mother drove to her son's house almost every day. She was tired of running back and forth. Mom, why isn't Lenora coming? Daniel asked her one day. Why don't you ask her to come over and see me? I miss her. Daniel, she said as gently as possible. Do you understand? And Lenora's gone. Her mom's sick. So she has to live in the village for now. Tracy Alexandra realized that she couldn't tell Daniel yet that Lenora had left him. It might make things worse for him. Mom, call her, he asked. Please. I want to hear her voice so badly. Tracy Alexandra was confused. She left the room and dialed Lenora. I'm begging you, well, play along with him, she cried. If he finds out now that you left him, God forbid. Well, okay, I'll say a few words to him. And that's it, the ex-lover replied angrily. If Wade finds out, he'll kill me. Lenora wasn't as affectionate as she'd been before. But Daniel was somewhat relieved. Mom, did you see her? His face turned contemptuous. I don't even want to bring her up, but we need to settle on a house. I think I'll be divorced easily now. I'll probably recover for another 6 months, and then I'll go back to work. My mother didn't say anything. She knew that it would be impossible to realize all his dreams. Okay, I'll talk to her, she sighed. Daniel, let's talk about this later, after you've been discharged. Tracy Alexandra urgently needed to get Carol back. Hanging her disabled son around her neck was not for her. In words alone, Tracy Alexandra could be the perfect mother, but spending the rest of her old age caring for a sick person was too much. Carol was screaming all over the house. She couldn't take it anymore. She'd never met such mean people before. She was putting her things in a bag. In fact, Carol was in such an agitated state that she could not control herself. Finally, her hysteria ended and tears were shed. After that, the woman felt lighter. I hate it, she whispered. Carol carried some bags outside and hailed a cab. Her mother had already called several times. She was frantically worried about her daughter. No sooner had Carol laid out her things than she was called. Yes, she said angrily. She had no time to talk. The phone interrogated her first and last name. Your husband was in an accident? She was suddenly informed. He's in intensive care. The chances are slim. Carol was numb. She couldn't even believe what she was hearing at first. "Mom, he was in an accident," she said quietly, and rushed over to her. Of course, Carol was very angry with Daniel, but she didn't wish him dead. "Are you going to go to him?" Mom asked. Her daughter immediately shook her head negatively. "Mom, what's the point of all this? He doesn't love me. He has a mistress. Let her worry about him." Carol wiped away her tears. Be that as it may, Carol still wanted to visit her husband, but she held herself in check. Why? She was talking to someone in her head. If he doesn't want me, she still had feelings for Daniel, and Carol couldn't hide it. But in the situation they were all in, her coming would have looked just plain stupid even in her own eyes. She had to deal with her feelings on her own. Still, she'd talked to Daniel's doctor. She drove to the hospital early one morning before work. "He'll remain disabled," the doctor said. "How's the verdict?" "Unfortunately, there is serious damage to his spine." Since Carol now lived far from where she worked, she, like many in her town, rode her bicycle. Kyle rode up to her. "Carol, come see us if you can. Really need your advice, Carol. Daniel's been in an accident." She couldn't stand it and cried. "He's going to be an invalid now." "You're going back to him now?" Consternation showed on Kyle's face. Carol noticed how his voice trembled. "No," she shook her head negatively. "He has another woman, and he doesn't care about me at all." The man picked up the bread and pastries and went about his business. Carol watched him go. Yes, the old jacket Kyle seemed to have worn as a teenager, the shoes with holes in them. As a classmate had told her, he didn't spend the money from his mother's pension, and that's what they lived on. And whatever he managed to earn or sell, he put into his rig. Why is that? Carol sighed. Those who live only for themselves prosper, and those who do their best for others are dragging out a miserable existence in poverty like this. Despite the pain, Carol decided to go out and accept her friend's invitation. It had been almost 2 weeks since Kyle had first administered the medicine to her mother. They hadn't seen each other much since then. Kyle said he had been very busy with work the whole time. Carol walked into her friend's house. He was smiling. It was obvious that he knew about something, and the guests obviously had no idea about it. The woman entered the room and froze in place. Standing by the window was Kyle's mother on crutches. "God, how is this possible?" she whispered. "Come out." Kyle walked toward her. Amber Adams demonstrated a few tentative steps. Carol looked at Kyle in bewilderment. Is this a joke? She was overwhelmed with emotion. "Kyle, you can't believe it." "It's true." He walked over to his mother and hugged her. "Well, I'll tell you honestly, if Mom recovers, we'll certainly lose something." He laughed. "But I'm willing to work and compensate Mom for her pension. I'll go to work myself. If I move normally right away," the woman replied. "For so many years, I don't want to sit any longer." The young people chatted till nearly 3 o'clock. This event was a big deal to both of them. Then Kyle walked Carol home. Or rather, they rode their bikes home together. And then he came home. Carol went to bed. She thought about the patience and stamina it took not to break down like that. And Kyle, he said, had been failing for years. He'd quit for a couple months, and then, it would be like an impulse from inside him to get up. He'd get back on track, her friend told her. Carol herself felt that now that she was free, she could do something useful. She would really like to support Kyle first. If I could find someone interested. She sighed. Then Kyle would have a chance at life. If he paid good money for the patent, it could be enough for him for years to come. Maybe someone else would invest in the invention. He had so many ideas. But again, it all came down to finances. The teacher Carol contacted told her right away that government organizations were unlikely to be interested in such a thing. They wanted everything for free. So you have to look for someone from serious businessmen. And where will you find them, these businessmen? She whispered frustratedly. It's one thing to be in New York, but it's another to be in a province like this. The next day prepared new adventures for Carol. Around 10, Tracy's mother-in-law Alexandra approached her stall. Panting with anger, Carol tried to be as friendly as possible. "We could talk to you," she smiled for emphasis. Carol thought it would be about the divorce or the division of the apartment, since those were still open to her. So she agreed. There were no visitors, and the woman stepped outside. She crossed her arms over her chest and waited. Carol, her mother-in-law, sighed. You misunderstood us last time. You see, she seduced my son. It was obvious she was struggling with every word. Anyway, she's been blackmailing him, threatening Daniel. She's got some man. I'm pretty sure he's the one who beat up my son 3 days before that accident. Lenora stated that if Daniel didn't bring her gold jewelry as a gift, Tracy Alexandra held her handkerchief to her mouth. My son would be stabbed to death. We wanted to make it look like you had my jewelry that she wanted. Like you'd taken it. Carol clearly sensed that her mother-in-law was trying to put her in a state of pity for her and Daniel. She even began to sympathize with her husband. Emotions overwhelmed her and she stopped thinking rationally. Okay, stop, she said to either herself or Tracy Alexandra. Now, don't make a fool of me. I wonder how it's possible to blackmail a man into sleeping with someone. That can only happen by free will. Did she tie him up, rape him? Tracy Alexandra was silent. She tried to catch a single sensible thought in her head, but she was having none of it. Carol, but I'm begging you. You don't leave him. Daniel loves you very much. He keeps asking, when are you going to visit him? I'm begging you. Her mother-in-law was still looking at her. But as far as I'm concerned, your son doesn't want a mistress. And you do now, Carol laughed. I'm always amazed at people like that. How can you be such a creature? I mean, you're nothing. How loudly you shouted, my Daniel, what's the problem? So you look after him yourself. Carol, well, you must realize that I'm not young anymore, she said in an angelic voice. I don't have the strength to visit him. One thought occurred to Carol, and that would be the last thing she would do for him. Tracy Alexandra cheered up. She didn't understand what Carol was talking about then, and Carol wouldn't talk to her again. To her delight, people approached. Tracy Alexandra almost sent her an air kiss out of joy. After work, Carol drove to Kyle's house. He was tinkering in the workshop as usual. Sitting on the bench was Amber Adams. She was happy, smiling, and greeted Carol. Oh, look, I walked with crutches. Much better today, she said. Carol hugged her with delight. Kyle watched them from the sidelines. He was very pleased that his mother liked Carol. Shall we go? He waved to his guest. There's something else I want to show you. Kyle, could you help me? Carol asked seriously. Do you think your stuff could help Daniel? Well, he scratched his head. I can't say for sure. But if you think about it theoretically, yes. I mean, Mom's bones are regenerating, and so are tendons and nerve connections. Could you help him? Carol looked hopefully into his eyes. If he agrees. All right, Kyle answered without much enthusiasm. I'll do it for you. Carol didn't pay much attention to his last words. It wasn't that she wanted to go on living with Daniel, but she clearly felt that she had to give him the chance. Thank you, Carol suddenly ran up to the man and kissed him on the cheek. Kyle blushed. He went out of his workshop under the pretense of taking something, rushed into his room and collapsed on his bed. He was very afraid that someone might find out about his secret. Well, are you ready? After a minute, he entered the workshop again. Carol, come on, look at this. He opened an old notebook with yellowed pages. This is a plate that is supposed to generate special radiations. Its power is small, but unlike those that now exist, such radiation should deliver the drug to the bloodstream without any interference. Are you saying that it is possible to somehow transfer the medicine into a vein without a syringe? Carol opened her mouth in surprise, but Kyle was pleased with her reaction. Carol, it's all about the radiation. It sort of takes the particles of any drug and delivers them to the right place. Rex has already experienced the benefits of this new method, Carol laughed. What was Oscar injecting him with? He was very pleased by the way Kyle laughed. It's all about the plate. It requires a special alloy. Then I coated it several times with different liquids. I have another idea. But it would require special equipment, very thin plates of quartz with other materials layered on top of them. I definitely can't do that here. The plate that I have, so far, delivers only 50 to 60% of the drug. So that's a start, too. Carol looked at this thin, unremarkable man and marveled at his intelligence. He spoke so simply about such serious things, talking about his mistakes and unprofessionalism. Kyle, you're a genius. Carol couldn't take it anymore. She kept her eyes on him. The man blushed. "I don't know anything at all," he mumbled. "There are such luminaries, I'm no match for them." "You're wrong," he said, and that struck a nerve with her. "I'm proud to have you as a friend, and I'm sure you'll accomplish a lot." "I'd like to get my mom back on her feet," he said sadly. "Of course, it's a miracle what's happening now. But I'd like to see her walking freely in the yard, growing her favorite flowers." "Kyle, I want to get her something." Carol's eyes lit up. "I'll bring her some seedlings and some flower seeds." "I don't know anything about that," he smiled. "I'd really appreciate it if you'd look into it." It was one of the best evenings they had ever had as friends. Kyle saw Carol off. Late. "Carol, thank you." A friend said goodbye to her. "I wouldn't have succeeded if it weren't for your support." "I really appreciate it." He lowered his head. "Kyle, you're a very good friend too, and I feel like you underestimate yourself," Carol replied. Carol touched his hair. Kyle got on his iron horse and rode toward home. His heart was singing. It was May outside. The next day, Carol wanted to go to her husband's house from work. Of course, there was great anger in her heart, but she realized that she would never take revenge, especially not if Kyle's drug could help him. There were no harmful substances in it. Any doctor would have said it wouldn't work. But as Kyle himself had said, it wasn't so much the composition that was the main thing here, but the process of getting it. Carol tossed the guests into her bag, got on her bike. She didn't know how she was going to talk to Daniel, or even if the dialogue would take place. Carol waited a moment to catch her breath. She went over in her head what she was going to say to her husband. She looked into the room, and there was nothing there. That was the most important thing. Carol really didn't want to meet her mother-in-law. And Daniel was awake. You could tell by the look on his face that he was thinking about something. Lenora had told him that she wouldn't be coming to see him in the next few months. Daniel got some kind of strange premonition. "What are you doing here?" he asked his wife in horror. His cheekbones shifted nervously. "Go away. I don't want to see you." "Daniel, let's talk to you," Carol said calmly. "We're adults." "This is all your fault. Is it your fault that I'm lying here right now?" Daniel accused his wife. "Daniel, come on. You know that's a lie." She tried to calm him down. "I can help you." He laughed to devalue Carol. "You've accomplished nothing in your life except your stall. Kyle invented a special drug that helps your bones get back to normal. It's perfectly safe," the wife began. "I don't want to hear about that quack. Although I'm not surprised you cheated on me with him. You're both assholes." Daniel shouted, drool flying from his mouth. "Get out, Tahir. I wish Kyle would die sooner. That penniless hobo on his prehistoric bicycle." "Daniel," he lifted his mother. "She's been in a wheelchair for years. This is your chance." Carol tried to ignore his profanity. "Go away," Daniel shouted, and his red face said he was in a very emotional state. A nurse came running in and asked her guest to leave. Carol saw Daniel turning his head from one side to the other and shouting something. "What did his pumped-up body give him?" sighed the wife. "His psyche is so weak that his muscles could never compensate for that loss." Carol was genuinely sorry that Daniel had refused her help. She realized that it was unlikely that his mother would mess around with him. She'd already hinted at it when they'd met. "It's his choice," Carol whispered. "I did the best I could. His accident wasn't my fault. I never cheated on him." 2 days later, Carol's mother-in-law came to work again. She was no longer asking her to go back to her son. "Carol, I think you need to take Daniel's situation seriously," she said. "I'm asking you to give him the house. I can't cure him on my own." "Okay," Carol agreed. "But on one condition, you'll never be in my life again." Tracy Alexandra agreed. After the tantrum her son had thrown at her about Carol, she had no more requests or complaints for her. When Daniel's mother started this game, she felt like a real queen. But every game comes to an end sooner or later. And the one who seemed at the beginning to have every chance to win, by the end of the game lost. Everyone had made their choice. Even the accident didn't break Daniel's pride. Who knows, maybe thanks to Kyle he could have stood up, but that would have been beyond the realm of dreams. Because men like Daniel would never reach out to men like Kyle. It's beneath their dignity. It was painful to recognize that Daniel's life had no value, as he lived only for himself. And such crazy romantics, dreamers who look like fools from the outside, are capable of moving mountains. And so ended the story of Carol and her husband. After that, the woman was never again interested in Daniel's life. He was rumored to be living with his mother. A few days later, Carol met with Kyle. The man gave her a very strange look. "So are you going to help him?" Breathlessly, he asked. For Kyle, you could say it was a matter of life and death. "No, he rejected our help," she smiled faintly. "Kyle, I don't want to talk about this anymore." "I'm all for it," he cheered. "Carol, Mom made her first cake today. She really wants you to come over for a visit." "Okay," she promised Kyle. "Tell her I'll be there." Kyle's invitation lifted her spirits. Carol worked through her day so effortlessly, as if she were being held above ground by some force. "You're glowing today," customers told her. "You're in a good mood." Carol nodded at them. She really did feel happy, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off her shoulders. The evening had been so wonderful that Carol didn't even want to go home. It seemed to her that this was where she belonged. They sat in the workshop after tea. Kyle stared at his guest. His lips moved as if he were saying something. "Carol," he said quietly. "I'm like, how do I say this?" The woman stepped closer to him and stroked his face with her hand. "I love you." Kyle finally said. "I love you too," she kissed him. "I want to be your muse." The woman whispered, "We'll do everything together. I'll help you with everything." "Thank you," he touched her hair. "Carol, I'm as lucky as Rex. I'll have not only a wife, but a friend and a companion." "I believe in you," Carol said. "You will succeed. Kyle, you're a genius. You have to admit it." "I'll try," he said timidly. "I'm not afraid of anything with you." The man breathed in the scent of her hair and couldn't believe he could be so happy. 7 years had passed. "Kyle, we're here," came from the backyard. "Are you home?" Carol headed toward her husband's huge workshop. On the way, she stopped and looked at the beautiful garden. She and Kyle had managed to find a sponsor back then, after all, and Kyle had made some very good money. They had bought a 2-story house with a large lot. Amber Adams was on the first floor. She ran the garden. Carol took care of the children, but most of the time they all spent together in the lab at Dad's house. Carol gave birth to a son almost a year after she registered. And when he turned 3, they had a yearling daughter and another boy. In general, as Carol predicted, Kyle became not only a scientist but also a caring father. And despite his crazy busy schedule, he made time for his children. Now, many years later, the man was again working on the development of non-contact administration of drugs by means of special radiation. There was a businessman who invested good money in his invention. And since Kyle couldn't live without his inventions, of course he agreed. Dad. His oldest son ran into his workshop. "We're back." "Oh," I hadn't heard his father jumped up. "How was your vacation? Did you enjoy it?" "Yes. Grandma didn't even want to get out of the pool," Oscar laughed. Why did he open his mouth in curiosity? "I'll tell you all about it later." His father took him in his arms. "Let's go to Mommy first." Hi, her husband hugged Carol. "I see the kids are excited about the water park," he smiled. "I don't know about the kids, but I sure am." Amber Adams laughed. "I'll have something to tell you about tomorrow at work." "I wish you could have come with us." Carol touched her husband's hair. "Next time, I promise." He put his arm around her waist. "But my muse, it's time to inspire me." "Mom, there's something we need to discuss in the workshop. Could you watch the kids for half an hour? I promise I'll tell you all about it tonight." He smiled as the kids puffed up their cheeks. Amber Adams stared after them. She couldn't even believe that almost 7 years ago she'd been practically unconscious. And now, thanks to her son, she could not only live a full life but make up for lost time. Siara was half reclining on a comfortable chair in the corner of the dressing room. Her friend and colleague Edith was on the armrest. Grace was sitting opposite on a swivel chair. She was telling the girls a story about an obsessive admirer who met her every morning at the entrance with a bouquet of flowers. "He's so serious," Grace said, amused. "His eyes are sad, but there's so much hope in them. Sometimes he doesn't say anything, and sometimes he starts to declare his love, and I'm so proud I pass him by." "Are you not afraid?" Edith asked, recognizing her. "Where do you live? Every day you are haunted by a crazy man." Her friend's assumption caused Grace to laugh. "He's like Raleigh or something. He's here on the dance floor right now, waiting for us to come out. And yet I'd be careful, he's a queer fellow." Edith shook her head vigilantly. "Come on," Grace grinned. "He's kind of funny." All the girls were dressed in short shorts and rhinestone tops. Their long hair was loose, and they wore eye-catching makeup on their faces. The girls worked as dancers in a local club, performing to warm up the audience on high platforms. Calypso's guests welcomed the three beauties, especially the male part of the club's visitors. How did Siara end up here? It's simple. She came to the audition when she saw an advertisement at the bus stop, requiring dancers for an evening show. The girl naively thought at first that it was a kind of concert hall. She knew how to dance, could dance, and loved it. Her childhood was spent in a large village with the beautiful name of Accord. There was a 2-story children's arts center on the central square, and it was in this center that Siara had been choreographing for as long as she could remember. At first, her mother and grandmother took turns taking her to classes. Then Siara grew up and got there on her own. Gradually, she joined the dance group. The girls performed at all holidays in Accord and even traveled to the city for competitions. Often they returned as winners, bringing back cups, medals, and certificates. Friendship, adventure, rehearsals, performances. It was a bright, saturated life. Siara adored dancing and did not see herself as anything but a professional dancer, until she realized that her abilities, although certainly not bad, were far from perfect. At large regional and district competitions, Siara saw girls of her age who could do things that she herself had never dreamed of. And her mother was against such a career. She set her daughter up for a serious profession. "Well, you probably don't have enough brains to become an engineer or a lawyer, do you?" My mother argued with offensive candor. "But there are other options. I was looking for a food technologist or a marketing specialist, for example." Her mother was right. Siara's school grades left much to be desired, mostly weak C's. In physical education, of course, a solid A, the impact of many years of choreography, but the rest. Well, the girl had no heart for science. She liked to dance. In her dance group, she was one of the best, but still not good enough to compete with young dancers in regional competitions. What to say about a higher level? When the time came, her mother and stepfather decided everything for Siara. They paid for her commercial education at the Faculty of Food Processing Technology. They rented an apartment near the university and sent her away from home with a light heart. Siara knew that everyone was happy to see her go, because ever since her mother had married Matthew, Siara had always felt like an extra. It was like she was getting in the way of their enjoyment of each other, distracting them with her learning problems and sometimes behavior at school. When Siara was 9 years old, Abi, her baby sister, was born. It became clear that the reserved and cold Matthew could be a wonderful father, tender, caring, attentive. The mother, too, had melted into the little girl. Siara watched them cooing over little Abby, and her heart ached because all she got were comments, heavy sighs, irritation. No, her mother and stepfather were kind of trying for Siara. They were really doing a lot for her future, hiring tutors, buying nice clothes, and planning deliciously for their eldest daughter's future. But it's all kind of on duty, just because it has to be. Mother and Matthew's heart belonged to little Abby. Her smile immediately made them smile and delighted. The only talk in the house was about the new skills and amazing abilities of the little girl. Years passed. Abby grew up, nothing changed. She was just some kind of a perfect child, obeying her parents, loving to read, trying to help her mom and dad in everything. And when Abby went to school, it turned out that she was also smart. The girl brought home only A's, exclusively. Siara loved her little sister, too. Abby really was a wonderful person, sensitive, kind, and fun. But to feel like an extra in your own home was really hard. And that's exactly how Siara felt. Dancing was the girl's only salvation on stage. In the circle of her favorite friends, Siara forgot all her sorrows. Music and clear movements invariably lifted her spirits. The applause of the appreciative audience drew her away. Except that one far from beautiful day, some businessman bought the children's center, and the club turned into a dairy. New jobs appeared in accord, well-paid ones, by the way. Some sections and clubs were transferred to local schools. But Siara's dance group broke up. They needed bigger halls, mirrors, a stage. Siara felt this moment hard. The only thing that filled her life with energy and joy was gone. No more rehearsals, no more walks with the girls after practice, no more road shows. It's all for the best, her mother exhorted. She had no way of understanding her eldest daughter, nor did she try to. You're probably already in your senior year of high school. You'll be entering soon. You can't spend all day and night doing frivolous things. It's time to start studying. Matthew, who was always on his mother's side, joined in. We'll pay for you to study at the commercial department of food processing. Your task is to study at least for C's, so as not to drop out. When you come back, you'll get a job at our dairy. That's it. Her parents had already made up their minds for Siara, but she did not resist because she no longer had a dream to fight for. Her plans to become a great dancer were in the past. Siara felt that she was hindering her stepfather and mother, that without her their family mom, dad, and little miracle daughter would become more harmonious and happy. So when the time came, the girl happily flew out of the nest. A new life, new acquaintances, bright impressions were waiting for her. Her stepfather transferred money to Siara's card twice a month, which was enough only for groceries, but the girl could not complain. She realized that her parents were not millionaires to provide her with a comfortable life. They already had to pay for her studies and rent. But there were so many interesting things in the city: movies, cafes, stores with beautiful clothes, nightclubs. All these pleasures were not cheap. And Siara, of course, couldn't afford much. She needed money. Studying didn't take much time and effort. My mother was right. The commercial department of a not very prestigious faculty didn't demand anything supernatural from its students. The main thing was not to miss lectures and attend all seminars. That's why Siara gradually formed a clear idea in her head: she needed a job. She can study and work part-time in the evenings. Waitress, saleswoman, animator, caterer. There were plenty of jobs for students in the big city. The girl methodically wrote them out in a notebook. In the end, she had an impressive list, some of which would definitely fit. And that ad recruiting girls for a dance show it came across by accident. Fate, no less. Of course, Siara couldn't ignore it. The girl immediately dialed the number indicated in the ad. She was listened to and invited to the casting. Siara arrived at the appointed time at Club Calypso. It was 3 p.m. The deserted dance floor looked really huge. Siara was even confused at first. A scowling security guard escorted her to the dressing room. There she was given a strange costume that looked more like a swimsuit than a dance outfit. A silver skirt that looked like a wide belt, a tiny top. The girl who issued the costume realized everything by the surprised face of the young dancer. "So you don't know where you've come either?" she asked. "I told you that you should make a proper announcement. You're already so fifth, you're gonna leave now. Too bad, you've got the right data, huh?" "What's the job?" Siara decided to ask after all. It turned out that they needed girls for club dances, slim young ladies who could move beautifully. When the degree of fun drops on the dance floor, the girls are released on the high platform, and they add energy and mood to the evening. "Will I be wearing clothes?" Siara asked. The girl laughed. "Of course, this is a decent establishment. Yes, the dancers' costumes are revealing enough to attract attention, but it's only dancing. And we have good security here. They make sure there are no misunderstandings." Siara thought about it and agreed to give it a try. After all, it was her long-forgotten dream to dance in front of an audience. Besides, the salary offered was more than good. You can't earn so much as a waitress. And the Club Calypso really is a serious place. As a last resort, if you don't like something, you can always leave. That's how Siara became a dancer. 2 other girls joined her at Calypso. At first, the choreographer showed the newcomers Edith's basic moves. Grace and Siara quickly understood what was required of them, and the choreographer was satisfied. "It's nothing complicated," smiled the man, who was a fairly famous dancer in the past. "I showed you the base, and then you improvise, move to the music, show yourself. You are beautiful, graceful, just nymphs. The public will love you." At first, Siara was shy to go under the spotlight. She realized that everyone was looking at her. But then, looking at her friends dancing selflessly. The girl was drawn in, relaxed. Now she felt on her platform, like a fish in water. Watching. Well and great, they admire, and there is something to admire. Slender, trim figure, long legs, shiny dark hair, beautifully flowing over elegant shoulders, huge eyes, black eyebrows, plump, almost like Angelina Jolie lips. Siara had once been shy of them as a child. Some of her classmates had even teased her with sticky fish. Now these girls themselves ran to cosmetology to inject fillers. As time passed, Siara began to enjoy her work. She liked to delight. During the dance, she felt like a queen above the crowd, because the girls' platforms were high enough so that they could not be reached by obsessive admirers, and the young nymphs certainly had admirers. The girls' safety was strictly monitored by two strong, pumped-up guys. The place was a serious nightclub calypso, not a cheap eatery, and not the third disrupted bar, but incidents still happened. Some club guests managed to achieve their goal of making their way to the girl they liked, and that's what happened to Grace. A young guy who happened to be in the club one day saw her and apparently fell in love. Followed the girl home in the morning, got her address. So now he meets her every morning with flowers. Grace laughs, but if it were Siara, she'd be wary. There's no telling what this guy has in mind. And how did he track Grace down? The club's employees were leaving the club in the morning through a different building entirely, the one next door. That's surprising. Maybe he bribed one of the guards. Still, Siara felt a little sorry for the guy. He must have grace in his heart to be waiting for her at the door. And flowers aren't cheap these days. Maybe he's spending his last dime on a bouquet for EVA. Everything's funny to her. Siara also had an admirer who knew more about her than he should. And he was nothing like the poor, humble guy who'd been keeping Grace in line. He was a grown man, mature and very wealthy. David owned a chain of high-end restaurants in their town. He was in his early 40s. Tall, athletic, fit, well-groomed, always stylishly and tastefully dressed, incredibly charismatic and charming. Her friends were even a little jealous of Siara because of the fact that David paid attention to her. Usually the guards suppressed the girl's communication with the guests of the club. But this time the owner of the club approached Siara and, a little stammering, proposed to meet. "One of our guests really likes you, a VIP guest. He wants to talk to you, just to talk to you. If you don't mind, I'll tell him, he'll understand. It's just that he's a powerful man." Siara realized that this was something very serious. The club owner himself was almost making excuses for her now. She felt a little scared, and at the same time curious as to what kind of important figure was paying attention to her. Who was he, this person who made the master embarrassed in front of her and an ordinary dancer? Yes, and to Siara's ego, this is a very big power. That's how irresistible she is, since she got such a man hooked. Anyway, Siara then gave her consent to the meeting, which caused the joy of the boss. David came straight to her dressing room. So handsome, so strong. He was not distinguished by aggregates, muscles and pumped-up torso, but nevertheless made an impression of a very strong and confident man. The man looked over Siara with interest, who had already managed to change out of her dance costume for blue ripped jeans and a stretchy t-shirt. David is mesmerizing. Really? Could this man be her admirer? Until now, the guards had been chasing away the boys who'd fallen in love with the pretty dancer, and now suddenly she had a man like this. David settled into the chair across from Siara and smiled at her. The girl's confusion seemed to add to it. "Why are you so risky?" He finally broke the silence. "You look so different on the stage." Siara smiled embarrassedly, her eyes downcast in a childish way that she couldn't quite figure out how she felt. This man, he was both intimidating and alluring at the same time. David took the initiative. He had mastered the art of negotiation. Siara didn't notice how relaxed she was. The man asked the girl about her life and hobbies, so that she wanted to tell him everything. He listened attentively and made appropriate remarks. Once in a while, Siara ventured to ask him questions too. He answered straightforwardly, without prevarication. So Siara learned that David owned a restaurant business and was therefore a very rich man. He also had a wife and children. The man did not even try to hide it, as well as the fact that he really liked Siara. He offered her to be with him together, to travel, to spend time, to communicate. "You're very beautiful," David said, looking straight into her eyes. These words from his lips had an incredible effect on the girl. She felt goosebumps run down her back, her palms grew cold, and the blood clung to her cheeks. "I'd really like to get to know you better, but I can see you're not ready yet. Am I right?" Of course he was right. David seemed to know everything in the world. Siara nodded cautiously. "Well, I won't rush you," David smiled. "But no one will stop me from coming and admiring you. You don't mind, do you?" Of course, Siara didn't mind. She realized that she would be dancing just for him from now on, and would search for David with her eyes among the crowd. He frightened her with his power. A voice with a slight hoarseness, the scent of elite perfume, mixed with the smell of expensive cigarettes. It all made the girl's head spin. But something kept Siara from taking a counter-step. She needed to think it over. David is married. He offers her to be his mistress. It's not an enviable role. After all, Siara was raised in a traditional household, and all her neighbors were the same. Such liaisons were frowned upon in their village. And it was scary to be in the hands of such a powerful man. Now the final step has not yet been taken. David is keeping his distance, giving her a choice. Will Siara have a choice later? That's the question. David was gone, and Siara began a time of anguish and torment. At night, lying in her bed, she imagined David, trying to figure out where he was, what he was doing. Maybe he was generalizing another young beauty or working. Was he thinking about her? Or was her indecision the end of a relationship that had never really begun? The next day was Siara's day off. She didn't go to the club, but on Saturday she was performing. Siara danced on her platform and desperately hoped that David could see her now. She was trying for him, just for him, and David could see her. When Siara returned to her dressing room, she found a bouquet of scarlet roses on her dressing table with a note from him. The man expressed his admiration for the young dancer and compared her to a lovely, graceful nymph. That would make anyone dizzy. David often came to the club. When Siara noticed him in the VIP area, her heart began to beat faster. The man sent her gifts, a bouquet of flowers, a bottle of expensive wine, a dainty bracelet. Sometimes he showed up himself. Siara always waited for these meetings. He sat in the dressing room in the chair opposite the girl. They talked. David looked at Siara interested. In his eyes read admiration and passion. David waited patiently for a sign from the girl, and this attracted Siara even more, but she still did not dare. Her friends called her stupid for it. Such a man, I shook my head dreamily. Grace, not like my begrudging admirer with the bouquets. If I were you, I wouldn't doubt it for a moment, said Edith. I wish I had been so fortunate. Try harder. Maybe you'll make it, said Grace. No, I've got the same beggarly students as you. Edith was not indebted. Siara had her doubts. Something kept her from becoming a lover. David has a wife after all, and he is pursuing her, a young dancer. This says a lot about both the man's moral character and his non-serious attitude towards her. However, all this became unimportant when David sat down in the chair opposite Siara and looked at her with his deep dark eyes, mesmerizing as a rabbit's boa constrictor. Siara realized that she was just a pretty trophy to him. David would play with her quickly and find a new object. And she was just a difficult prey to heat up the hunting excitement. Yes, Siara was aware of all that. And at the same time, she knew she couldn't resist for long. David had an almost magical effect on her. Siara found it increasingly difficult to control herself. His look, his voice, his palms, his lips. The girl had no strength left to resist. Good job keeping it together, the costumer. A woman in her 40s, said to Siara. The minute you go along with David, it's all gone. How many of them I've seen, first one, then another, then a third. But you're a good girl. You've got guts. With a pivot. If that woman knew what kind of dreams Siara was having with David. But the costumer's words betrayed for a while that her detached demeanor was the best strategy for dealing with the situation. The parents didn't know what their daughter did for a living. Siara didn't tell them she danced. They wouldn't have understood, would have thought their daughter was a disgrace to their pious family. If nothing else, they would have taken her back to the village out of harm's way. Once again, Siara would have to feel like the fifth wheel on the cart. And of course her mother and stepfather knew nothing about David or Siara's new lifestyle. They generally preferred to keep their distance. The three of them seemed to be doing well together. Some time passed. Gradually, Siara began to realize that she was losing herself. At first, the dancing, the club, the nightlife, the admirers all seemed like a bright adventure. But then the girl began to feel some strange desolation. Rattling music, cigarette smoke, booze being a river, sticky stairs, flashing lights, and David, who was getting more and more insistent and assertive. Siara's partners changed one after another. First, Ida's parents found out who their daughter worked for, showed up at her house and made her scandalized and forced her to quit. Then Grace unexpectedly married that funny fan with flowers. He turned out to be reliable, faithful, and genuinely in love. Grace appreciated all this to the fullest. The girls were quickly replaced. The new girls danced just as well, but Siara couldn't make friends with them. Maybe she just didn't want to. The girl drank a lot now, and somehow she became addicted to the energy cocktails served at the Calypso bar. They gave her strength, lifted her mood, and made her gloomy thoughts disappear. Everything seemed to be going well for Siara. She was dancing and earning money, and not bad money at that, and she was studying at the university in parallel. She even had a wealthy admirer. Siara knew that if she asked, David would do a lot for her. Nothing seemed to be impossible for this man. It was true that every request had its price, but it was no longer important. And yet Siara's soul felt a kind of hopeless longing. She wanted to be like before, full of hopes for a new interesting life. Modest, a little shy. But after more than a year of dancing in front of hundreds of people, it is difficult to return to the past, to the present. One day Siara decided to quit. She came with an application to the owner of Calypso, but he offered her twice the salary because Siara was so well received by the audience. So the girl stayed. It was true what they say, everything in the world has its price, even her, Siara. That evening the girl was coming home from university. Tomorrow was the exam. There was a counseling session today. Siara hadn't prepared anything for it. She already had an envelope with the right amount of money on her shelf. Working at Calypso gives her the opportunity to not waste time on unnecessary studying. Her parents, looking at their daughter's credit card, were overjoyed. They thought Siara had finally gotten smart. They did not suppose that 70% of these marks the girl just bought. It was hard to deceive them, but Siara had no close relations with her mother. And then there's David. He asked Siara to fly to the Dominican Republic for the vacations. A paradise, a luxury resort. A week alone with David, away from all the worries and heavy thoughts. It was the reboot Siara needed. There was no strength to resist David, and she didn't want to. What did she have to lose? So everyone's fooled, so why not make the most of this situation and enjoy it? And what happens next? Who cares? The girl was distracted from her gloomy thoughts by a frightened cry. The weak, trembling voice was full of despair. Siara turned to the sound and was stunned. Pressed against the wall of the house was an old woman, thin, small, with a plaid tropical bag in her hands. Her eyes were full of terror, for a huge dog was coming at her, growling menacingly. The dog must have smelled the meat the old woman was carrying home from the market. As luck would have it, no one was around. The big dog, smelling a weak victim, was preparing to attack. Siara, without thinking, grabbed a stick lying at her feet. Shouted loudly, "The beast," and went right at him. The dog was confused. He felt the strength and determination of his opponent. Besides, he was very embarrassed by the stick. He decided not to mess with the humans and ran away. The old woman, pale as a sheet, looked at the dog. She couldn't believe her unexpected rescue. Siara stepped closer to her. "Are you all right?" "It's okay, honey. It's okay. Thank you so much. I thought he was going to kill me. How did you not freak out?" Siara shrugged her shoulders. In the village, she'd often seen people fending off dogs. It was usually enough to hold something in their hands and show their confidence. Dogs are afraid of that. Such a beautiful girl, thin, young, and not afraid. Continued to admire the old woman. And they also say that men are the stronger sex. Siara smiled. She was pleased by this old woman's gratitude. She felt strong and good and kind next to her. A wonderful feeling. "I want to thank you," the stranger continued. "Don't do that," the girl protested. "It wasn't hard for me. It wasn't hard for me. and it's what anyone would have done in my place." "Not any of them," the old woman shook her head. "You have a heart of gold. Still, I want to thank you. I have something that seems to have been specially made for you, and I don't need it." This was where Siara was already torn with curiosity. What was this thing? "Shall we go?" The old woman smiled, noticing the hesitation of her interlocutor. "I live not far from here, in the next house." Siara didn't follow the old woman up to the apartment. It's not a big deal. There were so many stories about young girls disappearing. Still, she couldn't trust a stranger 100%. The old woman understood everything and was not offended. On the contrary, she praised her companion for her vigilance. The elderly woman was gone for about 5 minutes, and then she came out to Siara with a small scroll in her hands. The thing this grandmother was talking about was carefully wrapped in wrapping paper. "Here you go," she smiled, holding out the gift to Siara. "It's like it was made especially for you. It's amazing. It doesn't even look like that." The girl untied the rope in impatience, unfolded the paper, and could not restrain a surprised sigh. How could such a thing be possible? It was a painting, painted in colors, small, a little larger than a standard photograph, and yet all the details on it were written out with amazing precision and clarity. Siara, gazing into this creation, became more and more amazed, because the painting was of herself, while working at the club apparently, one of her arms reaching upward, her back leaned back slightly, long hair spread across her shoulders. Only instead of the usual mini shorts, skirts, the artist drew on her an exquisite light dress on thin straps, as if shining from within. Like a princess from a fairy tale, the image was completed with a thin tiara. Siara recognized herself. It was her face, her eyes, her eyebrows, her lips, her bracelet on her arm. Leather, wide, made up of an interweaving of thin bags. She bought it once in a gift shop. Inexpensive, but a favorite piece of jewelry. Darkness reigned around the heroine of the painting, lightly scattered by starlight. "It looks like you," the old woman smiled. "That's why I thought you should have it. It's one of my favorite paintings, but it suits you better, by God." "Where did you get this?" Siara finally found her voice. "Brandon gave it to me. The artist rented my apartment for a long time. Now he's been gone a couple months, but he comes to visit me sometimes. I used to treat him like my own grandson. I don't have any of my own, and Brandon's used to working. His family is strict and cold, so he melted and got attached to me. He painted so many pictures for me, landscapes, still lifes, and even my portrait, and he often paints this princess. She's dancing, or just sitting on the shore, or smiling. It's beautifully drawn. It's very beautiful. He's a talent, and he's appreciated. He is. That's why he moved out, isn't it? He got some money, so he bought an apartment in the center with a picturesque view of the river. She's a princess, or a mermaid, or a nymph, or just an ordinary girl. How many times have I wondered who that is? I thought maybe it was his favorite girl. But he jokes away. I saw her in a dream, he says, that's all. You can't get a word out of him anymore." Amazing story. "That's right. And you look a lot like this girl. Practically a portrait of you. That's why I'm giving you this painting." Siara smiled, thanked the old woman, and headed home. She spent the rest of the evening admiring the painting, becoming more and more convinced that she was the one depicted in it. And the facial features and figures, and even the movement in which the girl froze. Everything matched. Except for the costume, of course. Siara had never worn such beautiful long dresses and tiaras, but everything else was identical. There was no doubt about it. This mysterious artist Brandon, that's what the old lady had called him. He must have seen her at the club. During the dance, probably the movements from her dance and the painter depicted in his painting. And it should happen that the work was in her hands quite by chance. It was mystical. Looking at the portrait, Siara tried to imagine its creator. She knew it was a fairly young man. The old woman had said she treated him like a grandson. So Brandon is about Siara's age, or slightly older. He's also clearly a very talented guy. How accurately he captured Siara's movements. And the details. The artist didn't even forget to label the tiny mole on her shoulder. Maybe he saw it more than once. Maybe he even went to the club on purpose to get a better look at the dancer who looked like her. But he was seriously hooked. According to the old lady, Brandon often made the girl the heroine of his paintings. Siara hesitated for a moment. Wow. Apparently she has other devoted fans besides David. Except Brandon never showed himself in any way. He remained invisible to Siara. Remembering David, Siara wondered. Dominica, a reliable, strong man by her side. A wonderful week ahead. But then what? He'd go back to his wife and kids, and she'd remain in mistress status. They'll see each other occasionally. David, of course, won't begrudge her attention and gifts. Siara will have some luxury, expensive things. Maybe he'll even buy her a car and an apartment. But that's not certain, of course. And then David would get bored quickly. Siara knew that. The girl understood perfectly well that it was her aloofness and inaccessibility that caught the man's eye. What about her? Did she love David herself? Any feelings? Siara felt it for the man for sure. He drew her in with his strength and confidence. Determined and successful, almost omnipotent. And he looks at her, an ordinary student, a dancer, a girl from the village, as if she were a deity. It's not a fact that this look is sincere. David is experienced, mature, intelligent. He knows how to act to get his way. And yet, realizing all of this, Siara still reached for David. It was a strange, confusing situation. Siara wanted love, warmth, care, all of which she didn't get at home. In David's strong, reliable embrace, the girl would feel needed and protected at least for a while, and even, perhaps, could convince herself that it was not an illusion. And then, it was that later that made the girl hesitate and doubt. David would leave her. He would return to his family, find a new object. Would Siara be able to cope with his departure? Would she be able to take it? Suddenly, this painting is like a message from a secret admirer. Siara really seems to have aroused strong feelings in him. He portrayed her as more than just a beautiful demigoddess. Only someone truly in love could look at her like that. It's a shame that Brandon's in the shadows. He may have tried to get through to her, but the guards wouldn't let him. Not everyone is as powerful as David. Siara was suddenly very eager to get to know him, this artist for whom she had become a muse. To see what he looked like, to hear the young man's voice, to talk to him, and look into his eyes. Only how to find Brandon in this huge city. The old lady said the artist had managed to buy himself an apartment in the center overlooking the river. Siara knew nothing more about him, only his name and approximate place of residence. That's a bit small, isn't it? I wish I knew Brandon's last name. Then it would be possible to scour social networks or artist forums. But as it is, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Of course, we could go back to the old lady, ask her more about the young man. Maybe she knows his address, but it's awkward. And anyway, they'll see each other. And then what? She imagined that the guy was in love, and he might not be free at all. Siara's thoughts were interrupted by a call from David. They had agreed to call tonight. The man should explain how to issue a passport. The trip to the paradise corner of the earth was just around the corner. David became more insistent. He came to Siara's dressing room more and more often, sat closer to her, and even allowed himself to put his arm around her waist, which had never happened before. More and more often, Siara felt like David's thing. In a way, it was even pleasant. Next to him, she didn't have to decide anything, only obey his orders. On the other hand, it was overwhelming, but Siara couldn't push him away, couldn't refuse him. They were going on a trip, and there was already a special relationship between them. It would be a little while before they became serious. Siara's heart was heavy. She felt like she was making a mistake by getting closer to David. This relationship would change her, and it would change her irrevocably. Booze was a good way to drown out the painful thoughts. There was more and more of it in Siara's life. A glass of wine before bed, weekends at the bar with a beer. This trend was starting to stress Siara out. On the other hand, everyone around her was acting the same way. And it was okay, sort of. It was an ordinary summer evening. Siara was sitting at home, watching TV, eating ice cream, relaxing. Today was her day off. She didn't need to go to Calypso. Some acquaintances had invited her to a bar, but Siara had declined. She wanted to be alone in peace and quiet. The loud music and the hum of people's voices was enough for her at work. Suddenly, it was as if some unknown force lifted her off the couch and forced her to pull on shorts and a t-shirt. She was going downtown. Yes, a great idea to walk alone along the waterfront. She'd look at the houses, one of which appeared to be where the very same Brandon lived. The painting now had a place of honor in the apartment, standing on Siara's nightstand. Every time she woke up, she saw herself in the image of a beautiful princess and smiled. She felt warm and light at heart. Someone sees her with such eyes, it means that she is not indifferent to this someone. Despite a weekday evening, the center was crowded. Parents with small children, couples in love, and teenagers on scooters strolled along the embankment. There was always a festive atmosphere here. Siara walked along the embankment. On her right there was a parapet, behind which flowed a full-flowing river. On the other bank there was a huge park, overgrown with tall trees. Pleasure boats with vacationers sailed along the river. On the left side of the street stood out 5-story houses. They were quite new, recently built, but not typical high-rise buildings in the form of stone boxes, but buildings with fanciful balconies, galleries, and passages. Siara knew it was high-end housing. The passerby was really starting to make good money from his paintings if he could afford to buy an apartment in a place like this. Siara decided to walk next to the houses. Clean yards, spacious parking lots, a sports field. Behind the new buildings one could see old houses by which one could study the history of the city. Stucco patterned shutters, columns. Siara involuntarily admired the old buildings. Now some organizations were located here, and once upon a time, merchants and artisans lived in these houses. Siara's attention was suddenly drawn to the archway leading to the courtyard. I wonder what the girl was prepared to see there. Some old monument or fountain. But it was the walls of the archway itself that caught Siara's attention. They were painted from bottom to top, and not just primitive drawings or graffiti, but images that clearly came out from under the feet of real artists. Beasts, fairy tale characters, heroes of famous movies and cartoons, wise sayings written in beautiful fonts. Siara looked at this chronicle in admiration. What an extraordinary place. Her eyes blurred with the abundance of drawings. She wanted to look at everything, absolutely everything, without missing a single detail. And then Siara saw herself again. On the round, yellow surface of the moon, a girl with long dark hair, beautiful and sad, danced barefoot against the black of space. And again the same leather bracelet on her wrist, her favorite. She was still wearing it now. The girl's breath caught. This drawing was made by him, Brandon. The guy lives somewhere nearby and probably drew it just recently. The paint is still bright, fresh. The girl couldn't resist. She took an eyebrow pencil out of her bag and left a signature next to the picture. I've seen it. It's very beautiful. Only I'm not like that. Siara returned home in a strange mood. On the one hand, she was happy to discover another piece of news from the mysterious Brandon and to see that she did indeed hold some place in his heart and thoughts. On the other, it was even harder now. Because after what had happened, she didn't want to see David at all. A relationship with him now seemed even more wrong. Siara tried to imagine what Brandon looked like before she went to sleep. She might even have seen him at the club. She meant something to him, since Brandon drew her so often. The mother either died when he was very young, or her life was taken by an illness that developed after giving birth to an only child. The boy was raised by his father, a sullen and busy man, and also his grandmother, his father's mother. The child knew no denial of anything since childhood. His only parent, Jaden Wright, was a successful entrepreneur. The man always dreamed that his son, when he grows up, will continue his business. Jaden Wright planned to leave his mini empire to his heir. But something went wrong. Brandon didn't live up to his father's expectations. From an early age, he was indifferent to his business. Talking about purchases, profits, stocks, subsidiaries made him sad. Jaden Wright was angry, enrolled his son in financial literacy courses and economic schools. But Brandon was always there, in the ranks of the laggards, and the boy did not try to delve into all these wisdoms. His favorite pastime was drawing. From an early age, he drew on everything he could get his hands on: paper, books, refrigerator doors, and of course wallpaper. At the same time, from under the hands of the kid came out not the usual for such age scribbles, and quite good drawings. Then the boy had albums, as well as paints, pencils, and felt tip pens. His drawings improved day by day. Everyone who saw them admired them and advised Jaden Wright to send his son to art school. But he just dismissed it. He considered drawing a dabble, something not serious. The man planned to develop his son in another direction. As a teenager, Brandon could stay in his room 24 hours a day. In his sketchbook appeared fantasy worlds, evil trolls, beautiful princesses, courageous heroes. Drawing, The boy forgot about everything and about lessons, and about the need to go to school, and even about food. Drawing absorbed him completely. He didn't need anything. Nothing else interested him at such moments. And if it hadn't been for his grandmother, who had almost forcibly torn his grandson out of his familiar world, Brandon wouldn't have left his room at all. But Emily was relentless. She made sure that her grandson did his homework, ate on time, and attended all the classes and clubs that Jaden Wright had chosen for him. Emily and her son were practical, savvy, goal-oriented people. Brandon's creative nature was alien to them, and it is unclear what caused conflicts and frustrations. Brandon's mother would have shared his hobbies. She herself was very good at drawing. Jaden Wright still kept his wife's drawings, which she sometimes gave him. It was a transfer to paper of song lyrics that both spouses liked. Brandon loved looking at these drawings. To him, they were like a connection to the mom he never knew. It made him feel good to know that he looked like her. Years passed. Jaden Wright had almost given up on his failed son. Brandon was not the kind of heir one might dream of. Weak, unsportsmanlike, withdrawn. Doesn't understand his father's business and doesn't even want to know about it. He is always in the clouds, socializing with losers like himself. He doesn't think about the future, but Brandon was not much different from the sons of Jaden Wright's acquaintances. Children of rich fathers really rarely think about the future. They already know that everything will be fine. And Brandon, against the wishes of his grandmother and father, continued to develop his talent. At the age of 13, he enrolled in art school, constantly participated in some competitions and even won prizes. Jaden Wright did not particularly delve into this hobby of his son. It was not interesting to him and seemed useless. Then Brandon began to earn money. He was already painting quite professionally, and there were people willing to pay for his paintings, albeit small, but quite real money, and then more. Brandon mastered computerized drawing. He got orders. Digital illustrations were in demand in publishing houses. They were used for website design, advertising, and so on. Jaden Wright wondered how it was that his son had really learned to earn money by drawing. Really, what kind of income is there? Just pennies for pocket change. But it was his own. After high school, Brandon enrolled at the Art Institute. Although Jaden Wright had already made arrangements with the right people, and his son was expected at the prestigious Faculty of Economics. But the boy was adamant he was not interested in economics. He was not going to become the head of his father's business. I have a different way, Brandon tried to convey to his parents. What's the path there? And Jaden Wright didn't understand it. You can't make a lot of money with pictures. You're the one with the wind in your head now, and then you'll realize you were wrong. But it'll be too late. In the end, I did it my way. He was a tough character, despite his fragile exterior. And then Brandon left home altogether. Said he needed quiet and solitude. It made it easier for him to create. His father tried to offer his stubborn son money, at least for the first time. His heart was troubled for Brandon. Jaden Wright thought his son was not adapted to life, but he refused, saying that he had been earning money for a long time. The landlady accepted the young guest as her own. She was lonely. Her husband had died long ago, and God had not given them any children. So she took Brandon as her favorite grandson. Pancakes in the morning, borscht, knitted socks. The old woman enveloped the boy with comfort and attention, like a warm blanket. And it was pleasant to take care of this talented young man. Brandon did the same for Harper Clark. He carried her heavy bags from the store, helped her move furniture, repaired the faucet. He had never felt so completely accepted by his family. Brandon had high expectations that the boy couldn't and wouldn't meet. Here he was loved and accepted for who he was. Harper Clark sincerely admired the boy's work. She spent hours looking at his paintings, sometimes even gasped, not believing that such works could come out of the hands of such a young man. Brandon painted several landscapes for Harper Clark and even drew her portrait. The old woman hung it in the most prominent place on the living room wall. Brandon created custom paintings and worked for his soul. He also developed in digital painting. This activity brought a good income. At the same time, Brandon had time to study at the Art Institute, where the basic fundamentals of painting were given, thanks to which the guy honed and perfected his talent. The capable artist soon had like-minded people, the same enthusiastic painters of all ages, and with a wide range of experience. Brandon communicated with talented people of his city, organized exhibitions together with them, took part in creative evenings, went on plein airs. He had friends artists from other countries. Communication with them took place via social networks and messengers. Brandon's work, much to his own surprise, became increasingly popular. He received orders from all over the world. Now the guy had to refuse many. His work capacity was amazing. He could not sleep or eat for 24 hours, carried away by another picture. Harper often had to drag the inspirational young man into the kitchen to keep him from starving to death. But there was more to Brandon's life than work and study. With new friends, he often walked around the city, went to nature, went to the movies. In general, did everything that other people his age do. These meetings, they were a kind of reboot, a source of inspiration. Adventures, new acquaintances, beautiful landscapes. All this gave birth to amazing subjects in Brandon's head, which the young man then transferred to the canvas. Brandon had fans who were not just fans of his work, but a fan of himself. Mia, a young waitress from the bar, a student who worked part-time in the evenings. Skinny, with short brown curls and a scattering of cute freckles on her nose. Brandon and his friends frequented this bar. If it was Mia's shift, she would rush to their table, leaving all the other customers behind, the girl looking only at Brandon. She was mesmerized by the young man's intelligent, dark eyes, in which some mysterious fire was constantly burning. She liked everything about him: appearance, movements, manner of dress, and most importantly his hands, narrow palms, long aristocratic fingers. Probably approximately so looked young Dorian Gray from the famous work of Oscar Wilde. The girl showed her affection for Brandon with all her appearance. It was impossible not to notice it. Mia smiled at him, looked into his eyes, and inadvertently tried to touch his hand. And anyone else would have lost their head by now. But Brandon, to Mia's great regret, he paid no attention to her. Once upon a time, back in high school, the guy had a crush on a classmate. They even had an affair right after graduation. Stormy, bright, beautiful. Only it ended in a trivial way. One day, Brandon happened to see Leslie on the street. She was making out with a brutal, pumped-up guy. The girl did not think to be embarrassed. Noticing Brandon, as if nothing had happened, she introduced him to her companion and said that she was going to him because she had fallen in love and lost her head. Friends warned Brandon right away that Leslie was twirling her tail. Too superficial, impulsive, and infantile. The girl lived bright emotions. During the months of communication with Brandon, and feelings dulled. So Leslie went for a new dose of adrenaline. Since then, Brandon went into creative work and seemed to have stopped thinking about his personal life altogether. All his time was spent painting, for the time being. Until that amazing meeting in the most seemingly inappropriate place for such an event. So Brandon fully immersed himself in his work. The effect was corresponding to the guy got orders, money for his drawings of paintings, and increased demand. The young artist could even afford to buy an apartment on the waterfront, which surprised his father, who thought his son was not capable of such a thing. This neighborhood has always attracted Brandon. Cozy, unusual, beautiful. And what were the views from the window of the full-flowing river? It's a great source of inspiration for artists. Sometimes Brandon visited Harper Clark. He was drawn to the warm, cozy atmosphere of her small apartment. The old lady always welcomed him with a happy smile and treated him to delicious home-cooked meals. His relatives and close people didn't understand him and constantly wanted to mold him into something else. It wasn't easy to feel his father's disappointment. The fateful meeting that so changed Brandon and his outlook on life took place on a Saturday night in February. One of the guy's buddies was having a birthday party. The birthday boy decided to celebrate at a nightclub. Not the best choice, in Brandon's opinion. The guy preferred other places of Rest Rock Bar in the city center, where local musicians gathered, cafeteria on the waterfront, a large apartment studio of one artist from their company. But the birthday boy wanted something new. Of course, Brandon had been to nightclubs before. Loud music, bright flashes of Edith and ending and strange dancing. People in different, blank faces, in different eyes, sometimes laughter, smiles, and always drinking rivers of beer, champagne, cocktails. Brandon himself didn't drink such beverages. They dulled his consciousness and gave him a headache. The guy preferred to stay sane at all times. Yes, and he saw what happens to creative people, exhaustive, inspiration in a bottle of sad history. Brandon was sitting at a table that night, indifferent to what was going on. His buddies had gone to the dance floor. Brandon was not in the mood. He was thinking about the plot of the next painting, Dark Sky, moon, stars, a riverbank, and crossed highlights on the surface of the water. And in the center of this landscape there had to be something beautiful. Something or someone. Something or someone. Something equally mesmerizing, harmonizing with the concept. Brandon couldn't decide what it could be. Graceful animals? A beautiful tree? The human image he was looking for just wouldn't come up. And then a romantic composition began to play. Brandon wasn't particularly fond of club music, but this one caught his ear. There was a tenderness in the melody, romantic. And all this was well combined with the bass, which added accents in the right places. Brandon noticed that the heads of those present were turned upward. He followed the people's gazes and marveled. He saw the most beautiful girl in the world. No, the guy had certainly met beauties before. He posed models, after all, a graceful figure and a cute face, and the purpose was not to surprise. But there was something particularly appealing about the girl dancing on the platform. Graceful movements, huge eyes. Even in the semi-darkness, Brandon noticed how beautifully they shone like two diamonds. The girl was dressed in short shorts, high boots, and a shiny top. At the same time, she did not look provocative. All her movements were strictly calibrated. She resembled a princess or a beautiful nymph dancing in the moonlight. Brandon realized who he would place in the center of the moonscape. It would be Siara, the young dancer. Everyone was admiring her. He tried to memorize every detail, the curve of her dark eyebrows, the proportions of her beautiful face, the shade of her long hair flowing down her graceful back and delicate shoulders. That evening, as soon as he got home, the boy went straight to work. By morning, the sketch was ready. Brandon admired his creation. Yes, indeed, everything turned out exactly as he wanted it to. A beautiful lunar landscape of John, a nymph, a princess, graceful, delicate creatures. Brandon hadn't recognized himself since. All he could think about was the beautiful stranger from the club. The boy then went to Calypso, and more than once admired the performance of the beautiful stranger, the heroine of one of his best paintings. The canvas now adorned the wall of his room, but the lad made many copies of various sizes. Several of them had already been sold for more than a good price. Brandon was drawn to this girl more and more, but she remained out of reach. He had heard her name accidentally, when a friend had called her once. Siara was a wonderful name. It suited the young, beautiful creature as well as possible. Brandon realized he was in love. Probably for the first time in his life, his feelings for Leslie were nothing compared to what he felt now. Brandon wanted to hear the voice, to look into her eyes. He didn't know anything about this girl, but he had a good sense of people, and even from a great distance he realized that he and Siara were made for each other. Only how to get close to her. She's always up there high up on the platform. Brandon realized he wouldn't dare approach her first. He'd never been a tough macho, but he didn't usually have trouble talking to people. But here he realized that if he'd been near Siara, he wouldn't have been able to say a word out of excitement. She remained out of his reach. Beautiful, graceful, ethereal, distant and yet very close, almost kin. Brandon loved to visit Harper Clark. He liked the quiet, peaceful atmosphere of her small apartment. Every time the old woman was genuinely happy to see the former guest and tried to treat him to something homemade and tasty. Pies, pancakes, and borscht. Brandon would eat it all in both cheeks under Harper Clark's satisfied gaze. The guy gave her his paintings, and even once he drew a portrait of Harper Clark based on a photograph from his youth. She admired Brandon's work every time she saw it. "I can't believe a man can do that," she said, looking at his creations. That summer evening, Brandon came to Harper Clark's house again, bought her favorite candies at the supermarket, and went to visit. Sitting in the bright kitchen, Harper Clark in front of a plate of freshly fried, specially flavored pancakes for him. Brandon listened to the old lady's stories about her life. She had an argument with her neighbor, went to the clinic, the usual things, and suddenly, "Oh, I had an incident the other day." "I'm still reeling from it," Harper Clark admitted. "What is it?" Brandon looked up. "I'm walking home from the store tonight, and then, out of nowhere, a black dog jumps out at me. It's huge, angry, growling, coming towards me. I looked around and there's no one there, just like that. Well, that's it. I think I'm finished. The dog is rabid. Probably normal dogs don't attack people." The dog pushed the old woman back against the wall of the house. Harper Clark was retreating. When she felt the cold concrete against her back, she realized that there was nowhere else to go. She could only wait for the inevitable. Harper Clark's heart beat in her chest like a trapped bird. And there's a young girl, beautiful and very brave. She put her stick in her hands and attacked the dog. The dog smelled her strength, tucked his tail and ran away. My savior. The guardian angel must have sent her. There was no one else. Brandon smiled. The world was not without good people. He'd realized that a long time ago. So I wanted to thank her. Harper Clark continued. She didn't like it at first, but I told her I had something that looked like it was made for her. And what is it? Brandon wondered. The painting is yours. I hope you're not offended. I gave her that princess who dances under the moon. Brandon nodded. He understood what it was about. A copy of his most successful painting, the one of Siara. Of course I don't mind, the boy assured me. I gave it to you. You can do what you want with it. It feels good. Honestly. Just that girl, she looked just like the princess in the painting. Eyebrows and eyes and hair. Just as thin and beautiful. Similar? Brandon was wary. Yeah, I thought there was no such thing. It's an amazing coincidence. When I got over the shock, I saw the resemblance right away, and I thought, wow, that's amazing. And her. And when she saw the painting, she was very surprised, and she looked at it for a long time, unable to believe it. And then she started asking me where I got the picture from, what kind of person painted it, and so on. What about you? And I answered all the questions I told you about you. Only it so happened that the pseudonym in his creative speech did not go. I guess we were both confused. Me because of that damn dog, because of the painting. Her portrait is as mesmerizing as hers. Brandon couldn't sleep for a long time that night, going over Harper Clark's story in his head. Really? Has she met Siara? It was just a chance encounter on the street. And the painting that Brandon had been inspired by Siara had fallen into her hands in such a strange way. Or was it just a girl who looked just like her? No, Brandon realized, sensed with some sixth sense. Siara had the picture. She now knew she had a secret admirer. And of course the girl guessed that the artist had captured her in a dance, which meant he had seen Siara at the club. Surely now the girl is thinking about him, wondering who he is, trying to imagine his appearance. Brandon assumed that since fate had made such an interesting move, now that something would shift in his relationship with Siara. But nothing had changed. He was still watching her from afar, from the dance floor. I mean, she would dance on the high platform and then disappear, always disappearing. Brandon had tried to watch for her outside the club many times, but he'd never seen her leave. Perhaps there was some other way out of the establishment, some secret door. Or maybe the employees left through the office building adjacent to the club. Brandon was disturbed by the growing sadness in Siara's eyes. He could see it even from a distance. Something was going on in the girl's life. Either she was facing a difficult choice or something bad had happened to her. Either way, she needed the support of a trustworthy man. Brandon was ready to help her. In fact, he wanted to, if only he had the opportunity to do so. It was a warm summer evening. The sun was beginning to sink, coloring the sky in matchless pastel tones of pink, purple, and blue. Brandon was working, painting another picture for a customer. The man decided to make a gift to his elderly mother to present then, and a landscape depicting the place where her childhood passed. Guy loved the order. Brandon worked with inspiration and pleasure. From time to time he would glance out the window. The view of the waterfront always lifted his spirits. The vastness, the wide river, the smart people. A beautiful place. Today it was crowded. The motley crowd flowed down the street like a full-blown stream. Suddenly Brandon saw her. He could not be mistaken, he could not look at Siara. Because he had drawn her so many times, he had followed her movements so closely. Among the crowd of people he noticed the girl who had become his muse, his inspiration and his dream. She looked very different from her performances. Her hair was in a high ponytail. On her feet, stompy sneakers. A light backpack on her shoulders. Siara was wearing jeans and a simple gray t-shirt. But Brandon recognized her. Of course he did. What was the likelihood that Siara would be passing by his windows just as he took his eyes off the canvas? Minimal. There was no way to pass up a chance like that. Brandon rushed to the window. Now he would swing it open and respond to Siara. What happens then? It doesn't matter. The main thing was to attract attention, to hold the girl, to ask her to wait for him. She'll probably be surprised. Maybe even scared. But Brandon will explain everything to her, and Siara will understand. As an artist, Brandon was a very sensitive person and understood perfectly well that he and Siara were made for each other, as if they were halves of one whole. The damn window wouldn't open. The handle was jammed. Had this happened before? Or was I pulling it in a futile attempt to deal with the broken mechanism? It was no use. Meanwhile, Siara was getting farther and farther away. Judging by her trajectory, she was heading for the patio. That's where the windows from the other room looked out. Brandon rushed into the bedroom, opened the window, and leaned out through the waist-high window, looking for the girl. She was about to appear. But Siara didn't enter the courtyard. He saw her disappear into the arches of the artist's arch. It was a special place. The walls of the arch from the ground to the ceiling were painted by artists. Local and visiting painters left their mark here, painting what they liked most of all: animals, people, heroes of movies and cartoons, memorable places of the city, anything. The arch was mesmerizing, attracting, holding. Siara would surely spend a lot of time there, as would everyone who found themselves under its arches. Brandon would make it in time, make it to her in time for sure. What luck. The young man's heart was pounding. Would he look into the eyes of the one he had dreamed of for so long? The Arcade Pirelli's creations, among others. He drew her beautiful Siara there too. How could he not? Since the young man first saw the beauty, she often became the heroine of his paintings. On the wall of the arch, Brandon painted the surface of the moon and Siara dancing on it. Maybe the girl will even find her portrait. And if she doesn't, Brandon will show it to her. They were about to meet. Luck seemed to favor the young man as he sprinted out onto the landing. The elevator had just arrived on his floor. A neighbor stepped out and raised his eyebrows in surprise at the sight of the troubled young man. Brandon's hands were smeared with paint, as was his long apron, which he had forgotten to take off in his haste. Yes, he must have been a sight to behold. But Brandon didn't care about that right now. He was in a hurry to get to Siara. The guy slid into the elevator car and pressed the first floor button with force. The doors closed. The elevator rushed down. Suddenly it stopped abruptly. The car stopped between floors, frozen. In desperation, Brandon began to press all the buttons, but in vain. A moment later, the lights went out. The elevator was stuck. It had happened before in their entryway. But why now? Why was it happening now? Brandon called the dispatchers. Fortunately, his cell phone was in his apron pocket. Help showed up relatively quickly in about 20 minutes. That time seemed like an eternity to Brandon. He wanted to smash through the walls of the elevator and rush to Siara. She was right there, only 100 meters away. Her helplessness raced into despair, but hope was also present. This could very well happen. Siara lingered in the archway, waiting for him. When Brandon was finally released, he immediately rushed into the street. His path lay toward the archway. Someone was there. Someone was sure to be the lad heard voices. Indeed, in the archway, the guy caught a glimpse of people looking around in surprise, 2 guys and a girl. Siara was not among them. Disappointment, sadness, pain. Brandon was hit with a whole gamut of feelings. How could this be? He walked over to the wall where he had once painted Siara dancing on the moon, and saw the inscription that she had no doubt left behind. Siara had written that she had seen his paintings and that she thought they were very beautiful, but the girl had also informed the guy that she wasn't like that at all, not the way he imagines her to be. Brandon felt himself thrown into a fever. Siara had left him a message. She knew Brandon would read it. She might come here again, or she might not. Either way, any opportunity to communicate with her should be taken. Guy pulled a black graffiti pencil out of his apron pocket and made an inscription below the one Siara had left. He didn't even think about the content of the message. The right words were born in his head by themselves. You're the most beautiful girl in the world. The embankment under the old bridge. Siara will find this place, she will. And that's where Brandon will leave another message for her. Without putting the matter off, the boy returned home, took paints, brushes, changed his clothes, and went to the embankment under the old bridge. It was a quiet, deserted place. It was here, on the concrete wall, that Brandon would write a message for Siara. Or rather, he'd draw it. It's what he does best. All the more so because some unknown force was already pulling him by the hand to the wall, forcing him to create, to work, to draw. Brandon took on the task with passion. He drew the central town square, the fountain, the pyramidal poplars, the clock tower with a clock on the face. He marked the correct time. Then Brandon drew a bench, exactly like the one that stood near the fountain in that very park. And on it, on this very bench, the artist drew a girl. She sat half-turned toward the audience, head slightly down, cell phone in hand. It was Siara, dressed exactly as she was today. Jeans, sneakers, gray t-shirt. If she saw it, of course she would understand everything, but to outsiders the work would remain just a beautiful and realistic picture. Siara will understand. If she wants to, she'll come to the park at 6 o'clock at night. And he, Brandon, would wait for her there every day from now on. Back home, Siara took a bath, warmed up dinner, and turned on her favorite TV series. The events unfolding on the screen did not occupy the girl much. She was thinking about what she saw today, that mysterious artist Brandon. He drew her again and again in the image of a beautiful girl, not just a girl, almost a sky dweller. That must be how he sees her. It's a big mistake. The guy is clearly in love with her, and, like every lover, idealizes the girl. The artist sees her through some very different eyes. How fortunate that they are strangers in reality. Otherwise, this man would be disappointed. Apparently, he is very young and inexperienced, since he doesn't understand who she is. And she seems to be David's soon-to-be mistress. And Siara realizes that it won't be for long. It'll be a while before David finds someone else younger, more interesting, but she's still okay with this relationship. Why? But probably she wants to feel dear to someone for a while. And David, he knows how to court. Next to him, you feel unique, special, and the only one. So what if it's all just an illusion? It doesn't matter. The upcoming trip is the step that separates Siara from giving up on David. And she's ready to take it, was ready. The girl had already decided everything for herself, but then suddenly there was this picture in the archway. A mysterious unknown artist was trying to tell her that she was beautiful and worthy of true love. And it was at this turning point that this image caught her eye. When she saw herself in this image, she doubted again, doubted that she was doing the right thing. David's married. He'd already had an army of them like Siara. And how many more were to come? Maybe I should just say no to David. But the tickets are already bought, the hotel's booked. Perhaps it was too late, she should have thought of it sooner. Siara decided that tomorrow night after the exam she would go to the archway again and look at her portrait. And there, on that wonderful spot, she would make her final decision. The following evening, Siara stood in the archway again. This is a completely unique place after all. Even the atmosphere is special. And here's her portrait. But what is it? There was a new inscription underneath it. It must have been left by the artist. Or not. Maybe someone was just kidding. That's also possible. There's a lot of people here every day. Brandon, if it was really him, asked Siara to go down under the old bridge. This was already resembling a quest. And Siara just couldn't help but go there. The girl, trying not to change from a quick step to a run, went to the old bridge. It was at the other end of the embankment. It was a long walk, and Siara couldn't wait to get there. Suddenly, under the bridge, there was a solution to all her problems, a way out of the difficult situation she was in, even salvation. The passers-by looked at the pretty girl in a hurry. Siara realized she looked a little strange, upset, anxious. Her cheeks were burning, her face was hot, but her palms and feet, on the contrary, were very cold, and she was afraid that she wouldn't find anything under the bridge. Siara had put too much hope in this place, on the painting. Barely under the bridge, Siara saw it immediately and exhaled with relief. That inscription, it wasn't a joke, it wasn't a hoax. She had indeed been left by the artist, and he had also painted a new picture for her. This time it was big, the whole wall. The paint was still freshly painted, and he must have finished it recently. Siara already recognized the young man's handwork in his own special way. Realistic images emerged from his brush, as if a glow was emanating from them. Amazing talent. This time Brandon painted the central square. Siara recognized the fountain, the clock tower, the trees. How does this guy manage to achieve such realism? Siara could even see Edith's glare on the beady black eyes of the sparrows scampering by the fountain. And sure enough, Siara saw herself. She was wearing the same jeans and t-shirt as yesterday, so that meant Brandon had seen her. But why hadn't he come over? Didn't dare. Poor guy thinks she's some kind of goddess, but she's just an ordinary girl who's willing to be a rich man's mistress for the sake of a good life. Yeah, it's going to be hard for her to accept David's game after all this. I wonder what Brandon wanted to say with this painting. This time the guy didn't sign anything. But Siara realized that the plot was chosen for a reason. It contained some secret meaning. And then her gaze fell on the dial adorning the tower. 6 p.m. Could it be that Brandon was asking her to be at the park at 6 p.m.? But what day? Siara searched the painting with her eyes for any clue and found none. Saw only the time and nothing else. The girl glanced at her watch. Just in time to get to the square by the right hour. If she took her time. Or should she just give up and go home? It's time to pack. The flight's the day after tomorrow. Siara had never been abroad before. She's never even seen our sea. She's going on a wonderful vacation at an expensive resort. David won't deny her anything. She'll feel like a real princess, even if only for a while. But how to give up this fairy tale that appeared in her life recently and changed her so much? Siara realized she probably wouldn't find Brandon in the park. But there was still a chance, albeit a small one. And this guy, this young artist that Siara had never seen in her life, she cared about him. The girl wanted to know what he looked like, to hear his voice, to feel all the love he expressed for her through these paintings. Siara arrived at the square even before the appointed time. She couldn't walk slowly, her feet carried her forward. Here was the bench from the painting. Siara sat down on it. There it is, the clock tower, people all around. But none of them fit the role of an artist in love. Women with 2 babies. Men with a newspaper. 2 old men playing chess on a bench opposite a flock of boys splashing self-consciously in the fountain. Red-haired girl with a book. Siara sighed heavily. Obviously no miracle was going to happen. That was fine. She'll sit here a little longer and then go home. She had a lot of things to do. Things to pack. Call David. And then she saw him. It was definitely him, a tall, slender young man, walking straight to her bench from the fountain and smiling. He was looking right at her, keeping his eyes on the girl. The guy seemed a little embarrassed, but tried to hide it. "We finally met," he said as he hugged Siara. Nice voice, quiet and a little lulling. The girl was unable to tear her gaze away from his eyes framed by long lashes. The guy was clearly over-embarrassed and it looked really cute. "My name is Brandon. I know that's all I know about you, and that you have an apartment on the waterfront," the old lady said. Looking into his eyes, Siara realized that she wasn't going anywhere with David. She was staying here, with Brandon.